watching the live stream as well. We have three presenters today, so we want to thank them for their expertise in telling us about how pollinators and how to create spaces for them. Today we have Sarah Wittenberg, Eric Fuselier, and Coleman Little. He's running late. We got our game day traffic going on, so he'll be here soon. And they are going to help us understand the role of pollinators, their importance, and the best way to create space for them. Sarah is the Bee-Friendly Gardening Manager at Pollinator Partnership in Springdale, Arkansas. Eric is the president of the Arkansas Native Plant Society and on the National Board for Wild Ones, Native Plants, and Natural Landscapes. And then Coleman teaches biology at the University of Central Arkansas. So we want to thank you for coming today and teaching us about pollinators. We'll get on with Sarah.
Okay, there we go. All right, hey everybody, thank you for coming today. As she said, my name is Sarah. I'm a biologist. I've worked for Pollinator Partnership for about 4.5 years now. I do live here in Springdale, and I'm really excited to be here presenting with you guys today. So Pollinator Partnership is the largest conservation organization in the world dedicated exclusively to the health of pollinators. And so why should we care about pollinators? Well, several reasons. We need them to help us make food. They are food for other species. They provide many ecosystem services. They are an integral part of our planet's biodiversity, and simply put, they make the world more beautiful and interesting. So pollination is the movement of pollen from the male parts of a flower to the female parts, either within the same flower, between flowers on the same plant, or in between plants of the same species. And that pollen transfer enables fertilization and the production of seeds and fruits. Pollination can occur in a number of ways: gravity, wind, water, or by the transfer by an animal. And so when an animal moves pollen, that animal is called a pollinator. Pollination is essential to natural ecosystems as we know them. About 90% of flowering plants require or benefit from pollinators for seed and fruit formation. And about 1 out of every 3 bites of food that we eat is a result of pollination. And so these photographs I like to show. The one on the left, this is from a Whole Foods grocery store where they just kind of simulated this. If they removed everything, all the produce in it that was a result of pollination, what that would look like. And so that meant removing about 52% of the produce in the photo on the right. And similarly, this photo shows if all of the foods in the dairy case that could be traced back to pollinators were removed, you can see we would be missing some of the things that we all probably love to eat. In addition to providing food for us, pollinators provide many ecosystem services. So my background is actually in ornithology, and I am a birder. So for me, pollinators are important also as a food source for many birds. And there was a study on chickadees that found that it takes between about 6,000 to 9,000 caterpillars to raise a clutch of chicks. So that's a lot of caterpillars and pollinators also going into bird biomass. Okay. So by helping plants reproduce and sustaining vegetation on the planet, pollinators also help to regulate our climate. So who are the pollinators? It's a really diverse group. They can be any animal, like I said, that moves pollen, and this includes birds. Here we have the ruby-throated hummingbird that is, a really fantastic pollinator. Even some mammals, like this cute little honey possum in the top right. A lot of these non-insect and bird pollinators are found in the tropics. Many types of insects, of course, and even some lizards like this gecko. But the most important pollinators in most ecosystems are bees. Just to kind of further drive home how diverse this group is, though, there are some cockroaches that are pollinators. There are some species of mosquitoes that are pollinators. And they've even found that there are some crustaceans that help pollinate seagrass underwater. So when most people think of a bee, they think of a honeybee. And you should know that our most iconic bee species is not even native to North America. We brought them over from Europe for their honey. Honeybees are social bees. They form large colonies. And while there are some feral colonies, most are managed or under the care of a beekeeper. But they are considered agriculture, just like raising chickens or cows. They can be hard to keep healthy. Pests, diseases, threats from insecticides, not enough forage, and climate change pressure all take a toll on honeybees. And in fact, there is evidence that managed honeybees can negatively impact native bee populations in some situations through competition for limited floral resources, by potentially changing the floral communities if they preferentially pollinate certain plants, and those plants might end up being non-native plants. So we have a non-native European bee species pollinating non-native plants, and so those will proliferate on the landscape. And then also through pathogen spillover, the spread of diseases. So I'm not keeping up here with my bullet points, sorry. So in contrast to honeybees, we have over 4,000 species of native bees here in North America. And they are also really good pollinators, and they're essential for our food and our ecosystems. And unlike honeybees, with few exceptions, like bumblebees are also social colony-forming bees, most of our native bees are solitary. They don't form colonies. They don't have any nests to defend, like honeybees or bumblebees, and therefore they rarely sting. So I'm going to show you this video. This is our associate director's daughter sitting in a nesting aggregation of digger bees at her local school. Yeah. My computer is really loud, but you can at least see how many of them there are. And they're not threatening or gonna sting her. Okay, so many of our pollinators are currently in decline, as the headlines point out. And this graphic on the right, we just refer to as the windshield phenomenon. So 1998 was the year that I actually graduated high school. And you can see, I can remember, especially at night, driving around, and our windshields would look like this, completely covered in bugs, and you'd have to really scrape them off. I guess, fortunately or unfortunately, we don't have to deal with that as much anymore. You drive around now and your windshield stays pretty clean, but just in 20 years, there's been a significant decline in that phenomenon occurring, which is, a little bit alarming, because where have all those insects gone? So why are pollinators in trouble? Well, there are 5 big culprits. Invasive species, pesticide misuse, so using pesticides prophylactically in the home and garden, for example, to create monocultures of lawn or crops on farms, which decreases biodiversity. Parasites and disease, like we already talked about how honeybees can be susceptible to many parasites, which they can then transfer to our wild bees. Climate change, because basically what happens is you get this mismatch between flower bloom and pollinator life cycles. And so, for example, there are some insect herbivores that are so specialized that they're limited to just, maybe one family or a couple of genera of plants. And so if they lose, if the phenology changes such that they lose that food source due to climate change, then they don't have anything to eat anymore. And then finally, habitat loss via vegetation monocultures, urbanization, sprawl, which we're all seeing, especially here in Northwest Arkansas as we're out driving around, which results in a lack of nectar and pollen plants as well as nest sites for pollinators. And then, these 5 pressures also interact with each other so that they create, this synergistic effect that is really harmful to the pollinators overall. So what can we do, right? We've talked about the bad, but we want to focus on the positive. We want to focus on what we can do to help mitigate this. So there are 3 primary habitat creation strategies that I'm going to focus on in my talk. Keeping the natural habitat that you already have, creating the habitat that you don't, and reducing pesticide use. Okay, so keeping the habitat that you have. You might be surprised at what you already have in your yard or garden that is useful to pollinators. So you can create quality nesting habitat and overwintering habitat via the use of natural structures or by adding in artificial structures in your space. Ideally, you would make use of existing habitat by retaining what is already there rather than cleaning dead material from your garden. So you can consider like some of these elements listed here, the bulleted points at the top of the slide, which make great nesting and overwintering refugia for pollinators. It can be things like, you know, you have a tree fall over and you have some dead or downed wood, you just don't remove it. Because things like wood-boring beetles will get in there and create exit holes that then make perfect habitat for wood nesting bees. Brush and rock piles, building those in your yard and the margins of your yard can create really good habitat and shelter interfaces for bees to get in, or for small mammals to get in that make burrows that, say, bumblebees might really enjoy using for their nest. Shrubs can make really fantastic pollinator habitat. Things like sumac and elderberry and brambles like raspberries and blackberries. Anything that has kind of hollow or pithy stems that soft-centered stems that the bees can get in and hollow them out. And things like don't this time of year, as all of our wildflowers are kind of coming to their end for the year, just don't clear those away. Leave those spent flowers there. You can cut them, you can trim them between like 8 to 24 inches in varying heights and just leave them there to create nesting habitat. Also, you might consider changing your management practices. So limit mowing. You know, maybe there's an out-of-the-way part of your yard where you can just leave it, or you don't mow it as much, or maybe you only mow like a third at a time so that there's always an area of refuge for pollinators to hang out in. And then limit tilling too, because as you can see, the nest at the top, you can see this underground bee nest. You can imagine that tilling it would take a toll on that nest that's underground. Okay, so pollinator habitat is nice because it can also mitigate other environmental concerns. So you can kind of kill 2 birds with 1 stone by building pollinator habitat, because often it's going to serve some other purpose. So pollinator habitat often consists of deep-rooted perennials. They have really extensive root systems, which can do things like control erosion, mitigate nutrient loss, phytoremediate soils. It can increase the soil's capacity to absorb and store water and just overall improve water quality. So, you know, we have a lot of really fantastic watershed groups around here that are working to protect our waterways, and so you can build pollinator habitat, and it also helps clean the water. So, you know, when you install these native plants, they can aid in stormwater management through, maybe you've heard like slow, spread, soak, and store, right? The goal is to keep the water on site, and so these really deep roots help to do that. And we can do that through things like building, like this pretty photo on the right, rain gardens or bioswales and detention pond retrofits, and oftentimes we can choose plants that are good for pollinators to build those rain gardens. And then the other thing that I wanted to point out, which I will kind of circle back to briefly at the end, some of these resources that could be available to you. But the photo on the left is a really good visual demonstration of a conservation practice in action. So this was taken during some really, really heavy flooding events in 2022 in California. And these fields on either side of the road were owned by 2 different individuals. And so the farmer on the right had installed a bunch of these NRCS conservation practices, which we'll talk about, versus the one on the left. And so you can really kind of see visually that it made a big difference. You know, he wasn't dealing with flooding and topsoil loss and things like that. Okay, so you've preserved the resources that you already have in your space, and now it's time for the fun part, which is to create the new habitat. So the key components when you're going to build habitat are nesting, food and floral resources, and then just a safe space where they're not going to be exposed to chemicals that are going to be harmful to them. So if we start with nesting and overwintering, some of the things that you might consider adding to your space are just to have bare patches of soil. About 70% of our native bees are ground nesting bees. So they're going to nest in bare ground or sparsely vegetated ground. So you can help them to leaving areas of your ground bare. So basically, don't mulch everything so thickly or lay like that black plastic ground cover down so that they can't access the dirt below and then they can't build their nests. And here's a picture that just shows a bunch of ground nesting tunnels. You know, you might see this and not really realize what it is, but once you start looking, you're going to see these native bee ground nesting holes all over the place. Okay, so other things to consider are areas of mud, leaves, which are easy to provide. You can see the leaf cutter bee holes in these leaves. That's what that is, where they're cutting these perfect circles out of the leaves that they carry back and build the little cells. Like in the stems that we were talking about. Woody debris, which we already mentioned. Pithy stems, so not cutting away everything in the fall, but leaving some of those stems, or even the ones that you cut, you can just kind of put them in bundles and sit them over in the out-of-way edges of your yard, and then you're still, you know, you see like bee houses where you actually buy those tubes. You're just creating those naturally by putting them in bundles off to the side. About 30% of the other 30% that aren't ground nesting bees are tunnel or stem nesting bees. And if you want to offer a bee house, an artificial nesting house, then that is a viable option. You should just be aware that you need to practice best management practices when you install these, because they can become death traps through disease or concentrating them all in one area where a predator can come and rip them out. So there are some things that you need to do to maintain them. And we actually have like a guide on our website that I'll refer you to later if that's something that you're interested in doing. But just make sure you do a little bit of research before you put up a bee house and that you are maintaining them. Host plants, which we'll talk a little bit more about. Leaving that leaf litter so that they have a place to find refuge. And then, you know, planting like some of our native bunch grasses is also really good habitat for bees. Sometimes, like we talked about, like rodents might burrow down and then they might create these holes that bumblebees might come in and use. Okay, so there was the nesting, and now we need to offer something for them to eat in our space. So native plants are the gold standard, and there's a bunch of resources out there to help you locate what native plants would be good for your area. But it can be anything from trees to shrubs to wildflowers to grasses. And the more diversity that you can offer, the better. Something to consider when you're deciding what to plant is that you want to offer something blooming across multiple seasons, right? So sometimes really early in the spring, or now as we're getting later into the fall, a lot of your stuff might be kind of dying back and you don't have a lot blooming. So you want to try to incorporate different species that are blooming from early spring all the way into late fall, so that no matter when a pollinator finds its way into your space, it's going to have something to eat there. The more shapes and colors and sizes that you can offer, the better. Again, I kind of made mention earlier to these specialist insects, and so you know, you may only have 2 or 3 things and they might not find what they need there, but if you offer, you know, 30 or 40 different species, then there's going to be a better chance that you're going to host more pollinators in your yard. Okay, so host plants, we'll dive into this a little bit more now. I guess probably the most well-known host plant relationship is that of milkweed and the monarch butterfly. Monarchs will only lay their eggs and the caterpillars will only feed on milkweed. Here in Arkansas, we live in the path of the monarch flyway, and so therefore we're all in a position to do something good to help monarchs because they come right through here. Plant milkweed. I guess that's the best thing I can tell you to do to help monarchs, is to offer their host plant source. Now they will nectar on many different things, and so by providing native flowering plants, you're still helping monarchs. But if you can incorporate milkweed too, it gives them a place to lay their eggs and continue their life cycle. So there are about 25 species of native milkweed in Arkansas. And monarch populations are also declining about 90% over the last 20 years. And this map just shows the timing of the monarch migration. So you can see if you find Arkansas right now, we're at the end of their breeding season and the peak of their fall migration. I saw one just as I was coming into the library, so keep an eye out and you'll probably be seeing a lot of them around right now. Moist soil, water, sand, you can put out dishes is also good to offer. And then when it comes to planting food for them, just consider planting in clumps, because as they're moving about the landscape, it provides more of a visual target to them. If you just have one of something kind of mixed in, they might not notice it, but if you have a large patch of something, they're more likely to locate it and come to it. Okay, so I want to just take this one slide a minute to talk about integrated pest management. So we really want to promote people to use this practice in your gardens and in your space. It's just a science-based process to solve pest problems while minimizing risk to people and the environment. So basically what that means is don't just go out and spray a bunch of chemicals in your yard, but be more thoughtful about the process and the system. So really take the time to understand your space, to understand your system, to know what's there. Beneficial insects are really important, part of the ecosystem. You know, probably a lot of people, because you can buy them, right? A lot of people maybe are most familiar with like putting ladybugs or praying mantises in your garden because they're gonna eat a lot of the pests. So some of these predatory insects that are found naturally there, we wanna encourage those, because if they're doing the job of taking care of the pests and keeping things in balance, then we shouldn't be needing to apply chemicals to that space. And furthermore, when we do provide, like use an insecticide in our space, it's gonna kill everything. It's gonna kill the pollinators, it's gonna kill the ladybugs, the beneficial insects, and it's gonna set you back because you've gotta kind of build that system back up so that everything is in balance. And also I would encourage you to just redefine pests. Like a lot of people, you know, I think that some people hire these lawn companies because everybody else in the neighborhood does it, and we've just kind of built this mentality that it's what we should be doing. But, you know, the picture at the top of the green monoculture lawn versus the one at the bottom that has a little bit of color in it, and therefore, although there's nothing really native in that picture, it's probably feeding some bees. Maybe just be more willing to tolerate, you know, a little bit of messiness when a lot of people aren't. So just kind of rethink how you think about, quote, pests. And then finally, just make sure if you do use pesticides, you're being very mindful about it, you're following the labels, and you're really just only using it as a last resort if you've tried other things. So don't just make that your initial go-to. Okay, so you've decided maybe after hearing this that you want to help pollinators and you want to build a pollinator garden. So we're going to talk a little bit about how you might go through that process to do that. I really want to stress, if you're going to undertake this endeavor, that you do a little bit of pre-planning and a little bit of site prep, because having your garden in 2 or 3 years completely overrun with grass and weeds is no fun, and I think a lot of people do that and then give up just because of that, because it just becomes too much work to maintain. So if you do some work on the front end and you prepare your site and you get rid of all of the non-native grasses, the turf grass, the things that are going to come in and take over, then later you'll be a lot happier and your garden will be much more successful. So this is the time that you want to make sure that you take away all of the plants that you don't want. Take away the sod. There are different ways to do that. Take away the invasive species for sure, because you really, especially if you're going to use seeds, you really want to have good seed to soil contact. If you're trying to sow them through a mat of vegetation, they're probably not going to be very successful and it's going to take over. So you really want like a good clean canvas to start with. Compost and mulch are your friend. So compost is just decayed, broken down organic material that can be added to your soil to increase nutrient composition. And then mulch is typically higher in carbon content. It might be like wood chips or leaves or straw, and we often use this to help retain moisture and suppress weeds. So having both of these on hand can be good amendments to add into your garden as you're building it. If you don't already compost, I highly recommend it, because not only are you diverting that food now from a landfill, but you're being able to go out and use it in the garden that I'm sure you're all going to go home and create if you don't already have one. So there are many ways to do site prep. Sheet mulching, lasagna gardening, solarization, sod removal, and tilling are all ways. They all have, pros and cons. I would encourage you to dig into each of these a little bit more if it's something that you want to do, or you're welcome to talk to me about it later. I'm not going to get into the details of them, but there are lots of different approaches, and there's no right or wrong, and a lot of times it just depends on what your goals are or what your space is like to start with. Some people like to do raised beds or container gardening, right? And that can be easy. If you've already got those built and prepped and filled with soil, make sure that you have access to water nearby before you get started, then you're pretty much good to go. That's an easy way to do it. Something to consider is you don't want to compact the soil in your workspace as you're moving around. So you can minimize walking in the area by using stepping stones or walking paths. And not only do they serve a purpose, but they're also an attractive component of your garden, right? So when you create pathways and borders and edging, it makes your space look very intentional. So sometimes there's this movement towards kind of more native natural gardening, there might be a little bit of pushback from people. Maybe your neighbors don't like the look of it, or maybe we get people reaching out all the time because they're fighting against their HOA, or they're fighting against, a city ordinance that says like you can't have, quote, weeds in your yard. So these are called cues for care, right? You're telling people like I'm not just neglecting and not mowing because I'm lazy. Like I actually want it to look this way, and you have these very intentional kind of additions that signal to people that this is what you're doing. You're meaning to do this. So I would encourage you to kind of sketch out a rough plan before you start of how you envision your garden looking. This picture on the left was actually sent to us through our bee-friendly gardening program. So this was this particular gardener's plan about what she had in mind for her space. It's important to manage your expectations at this point. Oftentimes your plan is going to change, and that's fine, but at least you go into it with kind of like a rough outline in your head of what you want it to look like. And then I would also suggest that you start small. It can, like I talked about earlier with the weeds, it can become overwhelming and it can easily get out of control if you don't really kind of stay on top of it, at least at first. The nice thing about native plant gardening is down the road it's actually much easier, and we'll talk about why, but it takes a little bit of upfront work to get everything kind of in the state that you want it in. And so if you start small, it's going to be a lot more manageable, and you're going to be a lot more likely to enjoy the space and keep it up than if you start too big and can't keep up with it. You always want to think about, like, when you buy all of your baby plants, they all look about the same, but eventually some of those are going to get really tall and some of them are going to stay pretty small. And so you want to consider when you're kind of drawing that layout that you're going to put the tall plants in the back, maybe up against the brick of your house or against a fence, and the shorter plants in the front, or they'll just get swallowed up and dwarfed if they're all kind of intermingled. You want to, typically a lot of these native pollinator plants are sun-loving plants. They like to be in full sun. So if you plant them under a tree, or you plant a baby tree that, in 10 years is a big tree, it's going to shade out your pollinator garden, and they're not going to do well anymore because they're in the shade. So just make sure that you're thinking about things like that as you're making your plan, what that's going to look like when all of these plants are mature, and that they're still in a good spot at that time. Plant ground covers in between your plants. Here, our state butter, does anybody know what our state butterfly is? The Diana, right? And what do you know what their host plant is?
Violets.
Right, so violets are an amazing ground cover, right? So when you've invested in all of these plants and you've designed your garden and the layout, and you've got all of these plants that are gonna get larger planted, some of these living ground covers make a great mulch. So rather than wood chips or something, you can fill in the space with a lot of these really low growing ground covers like violets that'll help our state butterfly. I like to plant plants closer than is typically recommended, because the less space between, the less open space that you have to manage and maintain. So So make sure you have your supplies on hand before you get started. Sometimes these are the obvious, right? But you might want to lay out a tarp with extra soil and compost. This one is always a little baffling to me because you would think if you dig a hole and put the dirt and put a plant that already has a root ball and put the dirt back in, it would actually be more than you need. But somehow I always end up with less than I need after that process. I don't know why. So I always try to have extra on hand to fill in that space, to refill the hole. So make sure you have all the tools before you get started. It'll decrease your frustration later, shovels and spades and gardening gloves, things to make it more pleasant for you. And, this is the fun part, right? Now it's time to get the plants. So you've prepped your site, you've removed all of the turf, and you make sure that you have access to water and tools and compost. But you get to the point now where you want to actually select the plants, right? So again, I would always say, and I'm not telling you not to do the non-native plants that you really love. I certainly have some in my yard. But a lot of people say that, research has found that 70% is sort of a magic number. They found that in yards that have about 70% native plants, they have a lot more success with, for example, going back to that chickadee study, right? That one actually reflected that the chickadees were reared more successfully and did well when that 70% threshold was reached. So always try to aim for putting natives in your yard. And we have some really fantastic resources on our website that, again, I'll tell you near the end so that you can refer back to that if you want. But we have zip code based guides where you just type in your zip code and it spits out a plant list that would be good. And we have a find your roots tool where you can say, I have a spot that's partly shady and it's very wet. What would be good, where I live, and it'll give you some, even I would like yellow flowers, right? And it'll kind of narrow it down. So we have some tools like that that get pretty specific depending on what you're looking for. So once you've decided on your plants, then it's time to go purchase them and get them to your site. We have, fortunately here in Northwest Arkansas, a lot of really great native plant sales. There's one coming up at the end of the month at Compton Gardens. There's one that Wild Ones is doing the Goat Lab Brewery in Springdale next weekend.
Lowell, it's in October.
Oh, it's in October. Okay, so you still have plenty of time. Wild Ones, and maybe Eric can put a plug in for it again later. But every year another one pops up, right? And they're kind of dangerous because I go and spend way too much money at them. But it's exciting every time I see another one pop up, and there's usually some in the spring and some in the fall, which is perfect time to get plants and kind of, ooh, what do I not have yet? So we're lucky in that regard. But the best time to plant seeds for a lot of native plants is in winter because they need a cold stratification period to germinate. So you plant them in the winter and they get, frozen and thawed, and then when spring comes, they germinate. Spring and fall are a good time to plant actual plants. I wouldn't advise that in the summer because when you plant a baby seedling, it's really hard to keep them alive in the summer. Or you could try to grow your own plants from seed. This is called the milk jug method. So you use milk jugs and you make these little mini greenhouses and you sow them in there in the winter, and then inside that little milk jug greenhouse they will germinate. The only really tip I want to give you from my mistake is I used a Sharpie and it all rubbed off. So when they germinated, I had no idea what they were. That was not good. So don't use a Sharpie. Somebody said use a paint pen. Okay, so take your plants, go back to that plan, sit them out where you are going to plant them so you can kind of space them out and get a visual before you plant them. Keep in mind those earlier recommendations, tall in the back, short in the front, things like that. And then, some of this is just kind of common sense, dig a hole, make sure it fits. If they're root bound, gently with your fingers kind of massage and tease apart those roots. You want to kind of spread them out before you put them down in the hole. Make sure there's not a space under your plant. Make sure that they don't end up with an air pocket under them. So kind of tamp the soil down and add to until it's level again. And then give them a really good water right after you plant them. And you want to keep them well watered while they are establishing. And it's better to do infrequent, really deep waterings than lots of shallow, because you want those roots not to just stay at the surface, but you want them to go down deep. That way, when you do get periods of drought, your plants will be fine, right? But we just have to get them to that point through the establishment period. And then mulch, again, I was going for like mulching with leaves here, but this would be a good time when you first planted them to mulch, to give them that head start, to retain the moisture, suppress the weeds as they are getting established. Okay, so I like to show these. I just think these are really cool pictures. This just shows why, if you can get those deep roots once they're established, they're really not going to need a lot of watering. On the very top left, way over there, you can see the teeny turf grass that has hardly any roots. And then you've got all of these really great native prairie plants that the roots can go down. I'm looking at that chart now. I was going to say 15, 15. Like 15 to 16 feet deep, they can go underground. So actually, for a lot of these, there's way more biomass under the ground than there is above ground at the parts that you're seeing. And then this was an actual exhibit at the U.S. Botanic Garden where they actually use like glycerin and preserved these plant roots so you can see what it looks like underground. So I just thought that was really neat. So in addition to native plants not needing a whole lot of water, they just don't need a lot of inputs in fertilizer because they're adapted for that area. They're resistant to many insects and diseases that they're going to encounter there. So they're just better. You will, like I said, have to do a little bit of weeding initially to keep things in their place. And the picture on the right is a cardinal flower that I had in my garden that I was really excited when it bloomed, and I didn't know that they were like biennial plants, and then it never came back again. So it will evolve over time. You'll have things move around as they reseed, you'll have things die out, and you'll need to replace them, but that's just the fun of it, is that it's always changing. So seasonal maintenance, things to consider. Don't necessarily think of fall as a time to clean up your garden. It's really a time when your habitat is going through a period of dormancy and resting and recharging to come back again next year. So these are just some catchy phrases that you can kind of remember. Chop and drop. If you trim your flowers, just let them, drop them to the ground, or leave the leaves, or save the stems. You've probably heard of a lot of these, but it's okay to keep things a little bit unkempt and untidy because you're creating habitat. Remember, that's what we're going for here. So this graphic, this shows like the whole save the stems idea. It's a graphic that shows how to cut those back and the process through the seasons of how they'll just grow back and you're creating habitat. And then on the left, I think I took this from the University of, I think that was Minnesota B-Lab. I think I got that wrong. University of Minnesota B-Lab, they had this really cool graphic that actually shows, like we were talking about how some plants have really good hollow or pithy stems that make good habitat. These are some of the top plants that make good stem nesting bee habitat once the flowers are spent. Okay, so why are we doing all of this? This is the why, right? Don't forget to take pictures to document the pollinators that show up and use the beautiful garden that you've created. It's the fun part of it. Signs that explain what you're doing are really important to raise awareness and to encourage to your neighbors to get involved. Much of my own experience has just come from trial and error. So I guess like my advice to you is don't get too caught up in the details that it feels overwhelming and you don't start, because what's the worst that could happen? I've learned plenty. This was our house in Centerton. We've actually moved to Springdale now. So I got to kind of try it out in our Centerton house for 8 years, and then I got to start all over and take some of the things that I'd learned. You can see like this is just kind of a cookie cutter neighborhood on a tiny lot. So there's not a whole lot there to start with. These are some of my early plantings. You can see I used a lot of mulch. And this is what it looked like, when it was about 3 years old. And one of the mistakes that I made, for example, was my mom likes to bring me plants when she comes to visit, and she brought me a plant that had this little sprout in the bottom of it that I didn't really know what it was. So I just went ahead and put it in the ground. And it turned out to be this thing called creeping Jenny that completely took over the whole side yard, and I ended up battling it forever. So that was a mistake. And you can see over time, I collected some Biden's Aristosa seeds from a local prairie and some milkweed, and I got a lot of natives growing over there, but I never did get rid of that creeping Jenny. So be careful what you put in there. Sorry. We don't advise that you fertilize native plants. They don't need it, and it'll cause them to just get extra tall and extra leggy and flop over, which is kind of a nuisance. These were not fertilized, and still you can see the phlox and the gray-headed coneflower got really tall and flopped over the garden path, and the bees loved them, but the problem was my kids refused to walk through there because they were over the path now and they were buzzing with bees. So just be mindful that you really don't need to fertilize. They get really tall. One of our fun things to do was to see every year we would try to add a new host plant, and just like the saying, like, if you plant it, they will come. I mean, every single time we added a host plant, sure enough, the caterpillar came. So it was really fun to add, Dutchman's pipevine for the pipevine swallowtail, and passion flower for the Gulf fritillary, and of course milkweeds for monarchs we already talked about. So that's really something that's neat that I would encourage you to do, is you can find out, what is another host plant I don't have in my yard, and then watch for the butterfly or the moth to come and lay its eggs on it. And remember, host plants are meant to be eaten. So it's okay if they start to look kind of rough and they've got a lot of holes in them, because that's why we put them there. Okay, so as I'm nearing the end, I just want to kind of really drive home the point that it doesn't matter how much space that you have. All sizes matter. Everything that we talked about today is scalable, from the smallest container garden to a backyard garden to like larger demonstration and community gardens. That's the USDA People's Garden in Washington, D.C., all the way up to like a large-scale restoration site like this prairie in Arkansas. So adding habitat is going to have a positive effect no matter what size habitat you have influence over, and anybody can do it. So even a window box or a couple of potted plants can provide valuable food resources. If you think about a migrating butterfly, like a migrating monarch that we were talking about, that have thousands of miles to go, they've got to find a lot of food. They've got to leapfrog along that path, and they've got to find a lot of food as they're going. So even, a containerized pollinator plant at your house could be just the fuel that it needs to get a little snack and keep going. These photos are actually from our conservation program director's second floor balcony in Ohio. She says that she has 17 native plants, and she gets hummingbirds and all kinds of things that come up to her balcony and eat off of it. So your space has a lot to offer, and it can make a really big impact, and you can amplify your impact if you recruit your neighbor or your friend, right? So if those resources are few and far between, then it's hard for pollinators to make it. It's hard for them to find it. So if you can fill in the gaps for them, even better. And something that I just wanted to kind of drive home too is some of these native solitary bees have such small home ranges that they may never leave your yard. I mean, their whole home range could just be your yard. Now, as the bees get bigger, their home ranges typically get bigger, but just think like if you were a bee in your yard, could you find something to eat? Could you find somewhere to nest? And would you have a safe, chemical-free environment? So if you're providing all of those things, then good for you. And then kind of like these habitat corridors is something else to keep in mind, the connectivity. So educating others, getting your neighborhood, your HOA involved can help to create those wildlife corridors so that these pollinators can find the food resources that they need as they're traveling. And there are so many possibilities of land use types on which we can install habitat. There's a lot of marginal land out there. If you just kind of notice as you're going about your day-to-day, parking lot medians, or outside a business, they might have a little patch of ground, or these like hell strips or boulevard strips in between the road and the sidewalk, right? There's a strip right there that's perfect for pollinator habitat. So imagine if all of these underused spaces were turned into habitat all over the place. It would make a big difference. And we also know that not only is creating habitat good for pollinators, but it's good for communities too. So it's a way to engage with other people, a way to celebrate common goals, connect with other people in nature, and we all benefit from it. So really quick, just wanted to I referred to some of these throughout the talk, but here's my plug for my organization, Pollinator Partnership. We are a not-for-profit organization, and we have a whole bunch of resources on our website, like some of those planting guides and things that I referred to earlier. Pollinator.org is the URL, so it's really easy to remember. And when you go there, if you want, you can sign up for the Pollinator Action Team. It's just a monthly e-newsletter that comes out that kind of says some things that are going on or some things you can get involved with. And the program that I manage is called Bee Friendly Gardening. It's a membership program that works with the public to help protect, preserve, and promote pollinator health. And it's not just for backyard gardeners, it's really for anybody, like the graphic shows working, with habitat or working with a space that they can install habitat. And then if you're interested, feel free to scan that QR code and it'll take you to the page and you can learn a bit more about that membership program, but there's a lot of benefits that you get when you sign up for it. I also made mention that there were some resources when I mentioned those conservation practices. There are a lot of resources available to you as a landowner that you just might not know about. So like the USDA, the Natural Resources Conservation Service, has these conservation practices that they want to install on private land. So they just need landowners to say, hey, come put it on my property, right? They definitely can come out and do like a site visit and you can tell them what you're wanting to do and they will advise you, and that's completely free. And then if you qualify, you might get some financial assistance too. It just depends on your goals, but they can help you determine that when they come out. So there's these farm bill biologists. Arkansas Game and Fish Commission has an Acres for Wildlife program. Well, they'll do something very similar. A lot of the local watersheds have people that will come out and look and help advise you. And then, we have master gardeners and master naturalists and wild ones and just so many really fantastic groups around here that if you want to plug into this stuff, it's easy to do. You just sometimes might need a little guidance to know where to go or where to look. So feel free to ask any of us today at the end and we can help connect you with those depending on what you're looking for. Oh yeah, I think I already mentioned some of these. Audubon does a bird-friendly yard certification. We have the Arkansas Monarch Conservation Partnership here across the state that works to help monarchs. So a lot of really great organizations. And I'm just going to end by highlighting that conserving native bees and other pollinators by creating habitat does a lot more than just support bees, like we've talked about. You can see this is we put out an annual poster every year in concert with Pollinator Week, and we commission artists to make these, and there's usually a theme. But this one is neat because it just kind of shows all of the different ecosystem services and benefits to us too that we get through helping our pollinators. And with that, I will finish, and here's my email address. You're welcome to reach out to me if you have any questions. I think we're gonna do like a Q&A between each one instead of at the very end.
That's a question for Sarah.
Yeah, so feel free if you want before I step down and let Eric take over next. Yes?
I have a question about the milk jug. The kids and I tried that last year, and there were times where we forgot to water it, and some grew, some didn't. But with the milk jug, do we water it just like we would if it was in a container or in the ground, or less, or more?
So when you made your milk jugs, you did keep the lid off, right?
Yes.
That's the thing, right? Like, in theory, it's getting the natural rainfall, but we have some dry spells, and if they germinate at just the right time when we go through a dry spell, it's gonna all die. So I think there's probably not a good answer for that. I think it's like if we're having a dry spell, you're probably gonna have to supplementally water them. And otherwise, hopefully they could take care of themselves. Yeah. I definitely had that happen too with some of mine. I think it just got too dry. Like it was just, I could tell it was toast, you know, the soil was dry and I didn't stay on top of it. So, yeah.
Then you're obviously going to water it like you would any other seed.
Yeah, and by then you're probably going to be getting ready. Like once they're sprouting, you don't want to leave them in there too long or they'll get too crowded and die anyway. But right
We
over
don't
the
water anything, so we wouldn't have to water those.
So I think there's kind of maybe that sweet spot where it's like winter going into spring and maybe we've had a dry spell and they're starting to germinate is kind of the tricky period. Yeah.
I noticed in that picture of the people planting their plants there toward the end of your program, there were different size pots. Some were gallons and some looked like 4-inch pots. Is there, and this might be a silly question, is there a better size plant to buy to be successful? I mean, is it worth the cost of going with the bigger pots, or is it better to go with several of the smaller ones?
You know, I would not profess to say certainly one way or the other. I feel confident to answer that question, but for cost-effective purposes, I would say just go with the little ones. If you take care of them, they're going to become established and do fine, you know, because you're right. Sometimes those big gallon pots can be $15 versus the maybe $8, you know, smaller container size. I think you're going to be fine with either, honestly. So I would say if you're trying to save money, just go with the cheaper ones.
Part of the reason I'm asking is I'm retiring from the university in 2 years, and my first degree is in horticulture and greenhouse management, and I want to set up a native plant pollinator small business.
Yeah.
And trying to figure out, you know, as I think about this, which sizes would be the sizes to grow.
Yeah, and you know, then you have to also consider your time involvement because you're going to have to hang on to them longer to get to that bigger size, you know, which is of course why they cost more. But I don't know that they would establish better. Do you have Eric?
I mean, my own personal experience is the larger plants have a higher success rate
Is
of
it?
living, but maybe I'm just not the best gardener. I know like whenever they do like larger landscaping projects, they'll use a bunch of the smaller ones, the plugs and stuff. And just, you know, that way if one dies, and they still got all these others to supplement it.
But you feel like the bigger ones are more
In
successful.
my own personal experience, there could be some other variables there, though.
Yeah.
So, you know.
Yes.
I think that a lot of times when you're dealing with the plants, you start off in a small pot, and as they develop the roots, you move them to a larger pot. And if you're like having a business, that's a lot of work to keep moving them up and up.
And
But at
buying
the
more
same
dirt.
time, if you sell them all when they're little, somebody else is doing that.
I was figuring the ones that didn't sell would be the ones that would get moved up.
Right.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was saying, is that the ones that didn't sell are the ones you move up to a bigger pot. And they do have, the more roots they have, the better plant that you've got. But most of the places, like when the botanical garden has their native plant sale, most of them are like $6 to
Yeah.
buy like a small plant. But they don't sell all of them.
Right.
So they get moved up to larger ones, and then those are a little bit more expensive. And sometimes it depends on what the plant is.
Right.
Because some plants are a lot easier to propagate than other ones are. So,
The seed is cheaper.
yeah.
Any more? Okay. Thank you so much for coming. I appreciate it very much. I'll pass it over to Eric, who's going to talk to you about native plants.
Thank you, Sarah. Pull up my slides. All right, and so since this is the bee-friendly gardening program that is one of the sponsors, I'm going to be focusing more on bee gardening, native plants, and that's why we also have Coleman Little, who is now in the house. So you experienced a delay from the game day traffic. Who knew there was a big major home game today? Not me. You can tell I don't follow football, but all right. So native plants for bee gardens. First, a little spiel for Wild Ones. Who are we? Well, we are a national nonprofit. Our mission statement is we are promoting environmentally friendly landscaping practices to preserve biodiversity through the preservation, restoration, and establishment of native plant communities. So how do we differ from, say, the Arkansas Native Plant Society, which I'm also a big fan of? Well, whereas the Arkansas Native Plant Society is more focused on native plants and their natural habitat and promoting conservation of these habitats and these species, Wild Ones is more focused on native plants and the built and landscape environment and gardens. So we are a national organization founded in the, I believe it was formed as a LLC back in the early 90s, or LLC, because we're a nonprofit. Anyway, formed back in the early 90s, but has its roots back in the 70s. We currently have 117 chapters across 34 states. Currently, the Ozark chapter is the only chapter here in Arkansas. Have here 90 plus members. I believe we're over 100 members now. But we were formed in 2020, right before the pandemic, so our timing was impeccable there. Luckily, we didn't dissolve or fizzle out, and we're able to stick around and keep our motivation and energy going. What do? We have monthly programs. Our next one will be next weekend, Saturday, 10 a.m., West Fork Library. Laurie Scott is going to give a program on a beginner's guide to seed collecting. We're kind of getting to that time of year where you could be collecting native seed from different species around your place or wherever you have permission to collect from. She has a lot of experience with this. She managed the Outdoor Living Laboratory at NWAC for many, many years, up until very recently. And so she's going to give us a program on that. So if you're interested, 10 a.m., West Fork Library, a week from today, next Saturday. We also each year try to do these yard tours. We'll try to host those around. And then we also have a native seed swap every year. This will be our third one coming up in November. And then, we have a chapter, journal, and blog, but there's also benefits you get from the national organization, like the National Journal that comes out, webinars, some people like Doug Tallamy and other Benjamin Vogt, I might be mispronouncing that name, but other webinars that you get to access as well as other resources on the member site on the national website. Also, as Sarah mentioned, we have a plant sale, so some of the species I'll be talking about here in just a bit. You can come out to Goat Lab Brewery in Lowell. That's right there on 71. I believe in Lowell it's called Bloomington. Saturday, October 19th from 10 a.m. to 2 p.m. If you are a member of Wild Ones, then you will get 10% off select items. And then we'll have a variety of different native plant growers and sellers, as well as other people producing crafts and other botanical adjacent products. And then Goat Lab Brewery opens at 11, and so food and beverages from there will be available, of course, for purchase. So anyway, encourage you to come out October 19th there in Lowell, 10 a.m. to 2 p.m. And then at the end of this program, if you're interested in becoming a member, go to members.wildones.org/join, and you can pay. There is the Wild Family Household membership's $40, and that covers 2 adults and all children in the home. I believe there is a limited income option of $25 for people on limited income or students, that sort of thing. And then our chapter website, ozark.wildones.org, has a lot of other resources, as well as a list of other native plant nurseries in the region that you can reach out to, and all kinds of other stuff. All right, so on to the good stuff. Flower traits for native bees. If we want to create a native bee garden, and garden specifically for native bees, providing habitat, Sarah mentioned some of those elements that you need to provide, and she mentioned, I think number 2 was floral nectar resources. So we want to have flowers that are full of nectar, brightly colored with petals that are usually going to be blue or yellow, or a mixture of these. Bees cannot see red, as Coleman, correct me if I'm wrong. You're the bee expert. I'm getting this from U.S. What?
As far as we know.
Okay, as far as we know. Yeah, I guess we've never actually been inside a bee brain, but as far as we know. Some of this information is coming from, I think, U.S. Forest Service. Anyway, yes, ma'am.
Yep. However, the bees do get all over their coneflowers. They're not necessarily red. They're different colors, like the dark pink and the yellow and the...
Right, so when you mix blue and yellow, we get purple, right?
Okay.
So, yeah. So I think they primarily
so they
see in that.
purple, they just don't see red.
Apparently, yeah. I guess it's between that those colors. I think it's maybe more on that side of the spectrum. I'll talk a little bit about the ultraviolet, and I think Coleman will probably go into a lot of great detail. I've seen him talk before. Did you have something to add?
It was the UV stuff.
Okay, yep. We got that here in just a bit. I'll touch on it, and then I'll let you go into detail. Yes?
So Eric, is it the next thing you're gonna talk about the aromatic? Is that why they get on the red Monarda?
Coleman?
So they can't see the frequency red, right?
Okay.
But just like if something is emitting UV light, we can still see it. We're just seeing it differently.
Yeah, well, I was
Right.
gonna say, I know they do see differently than what we see.
And pollen, all pollen reflects a ton of UV.
Okay.
And so even, no matter what the color is, they will be able to see the pollen if light is hitting it.
Okay.
They might just not go to it first. It might just be kind of the last choice.
Yeah.
Okay, and it's also the minty fragrance, because I'm thinking everything I've got that mint, it's got mint is
We
attractive.
actually have no data to show bees using fragrances to go to flowers, but they do. We don't have the actual information
Okay.
to say what they're doing.
Okay, sorry.
No, it's all right. And one thing I was thinking about for the live stream, sometimes that doesn't get picked up on the microphone. So make sure everything you said, if you can cover, because I know you got, I don't know if it's part of your presentation, but you gave at the Native Plant Society meeting some great information about pollen and the UV reflectance.
I know I have a slide.
Okay, because I thought that was really interesting. So please cover that and the age of the pollen and how that affects it. So open in daytime. These are diurnal insects. Are there any nocturnal bees?
Yes.
There are. Okay. Well, according to U.S. Forest Service, where this is coming from, open in daytime are primarily the species for a bee garden. Provide landing platforms. That's going to be important. That's going to be a case with a lot of different insects. You know, butterflies especially. That's why those things like coneflowers, the asters, you know, have those disc-shaped flowers that these insects can land on to access to nectar resources, whereas hummingbirds, you know, have these more tubular flowers they can be flying and insert their beaks into to access to nectar. Often bilaterally symmetrical, meaning one side of the flower is a mirror to the other. So that could also, I guess, include radial symmetry, because I guess anything with radial symmetry is also bilaterally symmetrical. And then flowers often tubular with nectar at the base of the tube. Nectar guides, and maybe Coleman will go into a little bit more detail on this, but as far as a trait, many of the flowers pollinated by bees have a region of low ultraviolet reflectance near the center of each petal called a nectar guide. You have a picture here of black-eyed Susans, which is probably one of the more common native species to be familiar with. Starting about June, it goes in bloom all along roadsides, and so on the left is how we see it, and then on the right shows how it would look if you were seeing it under ultraviolet. So you see that that dark part would be, or these brighter parts would be, assuming where the nectar guides are, leading the bees to where the nectar is. So invisible to human eyes, detected by bees, as far as we know. Helps a bee quickly locate the flower center, benefits both the flower and the bee. The bee can more rapidly access and collect that nectar, and then the flower is going to be more effectively pollinated. So there's that mutual benefit there. All right, so let's talk a little bit about some species. First, as Sarah mentioned, many of the species are going to prefer full sun. Have a section, basically two sections. One is flowers for full sun, other is for full or partial sun. So after this, we'll talk about some that can handle a little shade, but for those that are strictly full sun, these are going to have evolved in natural habitats, including prairies, glades, planting locations. Well, open areas, obviously, that are going to get plenty of sun. So south-facing slope here in the Ozarks, where we have these slopes, we're in the northern hemisphere, so the sun is slightly towards the southern half of the sky. And so a lot of times on north-facing slopes, you get these shady environments. So, you know, just kind of consider that when you're considering where to place your garden. There are a lot of, that's why we tend to have mesic forest communities on the north slopes, because there's less soil evaporation, on these sides so the soil stays more moist, whereas on the south slope you have drier forest communities that are going to have more soil evaporation and adapted to the drier soil. Or the south side of a house or building is going to get more sun throughout the day than the north side. Of course, assuming all things equal as far as topography. All right, so Coreopsis, tall Coreopsis for one, Coreopsis tripteris, can grow between 2 to 8 feet. Blooms second half of the year, July through September. So this one should be wrapping up its bloom period, but one to definitely include this time of year, as Sarah mentioned, wanting to provide these nectar resources throughout the growing season. So this would be one for that second half of summer. Germander, a little bit shorter, 1.5 to 3 feet, June through September, a little bit longer bloom period, but again, through the summertime, through pretty much the length of the summer. Foxglove beard tongue, Penstemon digitalis, more of a spring bloomer, April through June. This is one of my favorites. I fell in love with this plant on a plant training I took at a field workshop with Theo Witzel maybe 10 years ago. And he had pointed out the reason the penstemons are called beard tongues is they have these, what is it called? It's like a false stamen in the middle. It has these little hairy things on the bottom of each flower. And I wish I had a close-up to show you. But over here, this part of the flower, if you look in it, there'll be this part with these little hairs on there. It's like a bearded tongue. And it just gives me a chuckle. Every time I see it, I think of a Muppet. And I think of like Animal, or Gonzo, Grover, or something like that, So I don't know. They got Muppet energy for me. So it was I go out to my garden when they're in bloom, and if the day's been stressful, I can just go stare at my beard tongues, and it fills me with some warm, happy energy. So I like to share that. Sounds like maybe next time you won't look at the beard tongue the same way again. All right, common milkweed, Asclepias syriaca. Get up to 3 feet. I don't know. I think these can get a little bit taller. This is coming from Don Kurz's book, but I know I have one that's up to 6-7 feet. So anyway, June through August, so definitely a summer bloomer. And again, important for the monarch butterflies, as Sarah mentioned. Butterfly weed, or as Doug Tallamy is trying to rebrand this, Monarch's Delight. And I like to put that out there as much as possible, even so much that my daughter will correct me if I call it butterfly milkweed. It's Monarch's Delight or Butterfly's Delight, and when it's blooming, and she's in the back of the room. If you want to wave at everyone, I'm going to put her on the spot there. And so, because, a lot of the issue that native plants have with branding is, if a weed's supposed to be something you don't want, then why is weed in so many of our plant names? In an agricultural setting, maybe this would be a weed to a farmer. But if we're losing the meaning of the importance these plants play in the ecosystem. So if we can come up with better names like Monarch's Delight, it really does help describe better the role this plant plays and the importance, and it's a lot easier to sell something called Monarch's Delight than it would be butterfly weed, right? Obedient plant. This is a fun one because if it's obedient, because you can take the stem, bend it, and it will stay like that. Again, blooms in the summertime, June through September. Purple prairie clover, one of our native clovers, not the same genus as the white clover or purple or red clover, crimson clover, or the trifolium genus. These are the dahlias, so Dahlia purpurea. Another one that is pretty short, but nonetheless a legume, so it's fixing nitrogen, putting nitrogen in the soil, blooms in the summer, June through August. Prairie blazing star, Liatris pycnostachya, and there are various different Liatris species. This is a photo I took out at Cyril's Prairie in Rogers, which is a remnant prairie that used to cover the entire part of where Rogers, Bentonville, Centerton are. A lot of that's been developed because, unfortunately, prairies and grasslands are the first places to become developed because you don't have to clear trees. And so a lot of times when it comes to where cities were placed in the eastern half of the United States or where pastures and cows are put on. A lot of those were historic prairies. So there are great organizations out there like the Southeastern Grasslands Initiative, which are trying to raise awareness of old growth grasslands that are incredibly biodiverse, have soil that's so developed with fungus and all sorts of great stuff that gets lost as these sites become disturbed or the biodiversity is reduced. But it's a beautiful flower, these tubular shaped flower heads. I believe this was the trip where my daughter got bad chiggers, so I think that was the worst of it, and she'll tell you all about it. But Western ironweed, Vernonia baldwinii, also you might hear it called Baldwin's ironweed. One thing I really like about this one is very drought resistant. During this drought that we had over the summer, it was still blooming. I didn't even water it. My coneflowers, during those droughts, they'll do fine on the foliage, but they're not putting out flowers during those times. They're not putting that extra energy into reproduction. But Baldwin's ironweed just keeps on flowering. So definitely one that as climate continues to change is going to be more resilient, climate resilient species, more drought resistant, can handle those droughty periods. And then if you ever had a chance one year when we had a really wet August, going out to Woolsey Wet Prairie, and oh man, the amount of ironweed in bloom out there was phenomenal. Normally not that much in bloom in August until you get all that water. Vernonia mazurica, or I assume that's how you say it, mazurica, Missouri ironweed. Another one, also summer bloomer. And then hibiscus, rose mallow. You might have seen like Rose of Sharon, that's also a hibiscus. Anybody grow a vegetable garden? Yeah, what does this flower remind you of? Which vegetable? Anybody grow okra? Yeah, the same family. This is in the okra family. So all members of or the mallow family. So okra's in that mallow family. So okra, if you put it in the stews, it makes it, it's a soup thickener, kind of has a slimy texture. Same way with a lot of the mallow families. If you take these flowers, rub the petals between your fingers, it's going to get all mucilaginous and slimy. It's got that property to it. So one of the wild edible foraging uses of the mallow family is as soup thickeners. And the flowers of most members of that family are edible. Rose mallow is going to be like a little bit wetter environments, especially the swamp mallow, something you see growing definitely in wetlands, typically along the edges of wet areas, edges of inundation. But another late summer bloomer, you can definitely grow this in a landscape setting. You just might want to give it a little more water during the year to see how it's doing, especially if you want it to bloom. All right, so what about some that can take a little bit shade? And we're not talking about full shade, we're talking about partial shade. They can do well. They like these open, sunny environments, but maybe can be planted on the side of a building where it's going to catch a little bit of shade for part of the day after the sun is either in the early morning or late afternoon when it's behind the building. Natural habitats may include savannas, in these areas where you have trees, but they're a little more spread out, so that tree is going to provide occasional shade. Or open forests where or what we call woodland, so not quite a closed canopy forest, but the trees are going to have some gaps in the canopy. Forest edges, similar to planting along the side of a building or structure. That forest edge might provide shade for part of the day, but not for the other part of the day, especially if it's like the east or west side of that forest edge. As well as open prairies and glades, because these also do well in just full sun with no shade. But you got to think a lot of species had to learn how to adapt to the occasional thing that was blocking out their sun. So some of these created these adaptations that could handle shade for part of the day, even when they might have evolved out in the open prairie ecosystems. All right, so Pachera aria, or golden ragwort, is a spring bloomer. This is also one that will start producing the foliage in the winter time, or late winter, early spring. So before anything's blooming, you'll see these green leaves on the ground, whether that be in your garden or out in the wild. So it is definitely one with winter interest, at least as far south as we are. where we have enough warm days in winter to provide that. And then by April and May, it is blooming. Golden Alexander, second half of spring, it is blooming. So another great one, Zizia aurea. And then common cinquefoil, Potentilla simplex. Cinquefoil, 5 cinque, right? Foil, foliage, so it has these 5 leaves, or these palmate leaves. Tends to be sprawling on the ground, more of a great ground cover for a sunny area, or one that has partial shade. This grows naturally out at our place in an area that's kind of has a few trees, but definitely gets a lot of sun for most of the day, but then can handle that shade for part of the day. And then the Baptisias. We have quite a few different species of Baptisia in here in Arkansas. And so these are like the wild indigos. So Baptisia sphaerocarpa, could be mispronouncing that. Again, these are herbaceous species in the legume or pea family. Get maybe 2 to 3 feet tall and bloom in the spring, the second half of spring. Also cream false indigo, Baptisia bractea. These, if you drive out in the Buffalo River area, at least a couple years ago, these were in bloom all along the roadsides. I don't know if that's a yearly thing or if that was just a good year for them. Sometimes it seems like the conditions are right some years to promote certain species. Definitely a place I've seen them. And this is a picture I took out at Devil's Eyebrow Natural Area, if anybody knows what that is, in northeast Benton County. Really highly diverse botanical area, and also just a beautiful area to explore. Devil's Eyebrow Natural Area, out by Garfield. Blue wild indigo, Baptisia australis. It's a little bit taller, 3 to 4 feet. Blooms around the same time, May through June. Baptisia alba, cream false indigo. Is that? No, that's white indigo. I think I copied this slide over and forgot to update that. So white indigo, April through May. And then we have Penstemon pallidus, or different species of beard tongue, pale beard tongue. It can handle a little more shade. Sometimes you might see that growing in a little bit wooded area that still gets plenty of sun. Wild hyacinth, so Chamasia scleroides. And for a shrub, New Jersey tea. Another great one just for pollinators in general. My understanding of the story behind this common name, New Jersey tea, is that when the American colonialists were protesting British tea, they used this as a tea substitute because you can make a wild tea with it. However, it does not contain caffeine, so I'm sure they had plenty of caffeine withdrawal. But I think that's how it got started to be called New Jersey tea. If you are looking for a native species that does have caffeine, Yaupon holly, Ilex vomitoria. Interesting story of how it got that specific epithet of vomitoria. I guess the natives would use that drink in what they would call, or what the Westerner anthropologists, ethnographers recorded as the black drink, and it was a ceremonial drink that they would use, and it would cause them to vomit. And whether it was the Yaupon holly or some of the other species that were mixed in there is debated, but nonetheless, the naturalist who noticed that, had the privilege of naming the scientific name of Yaupon holly, named it Ilex vomitoria. So, nonetheless, a beautiful species. Does not grow native here to the Ozarks, but south of here, Louisiana, maybe southern Arkansas. I'd have to look that up, but definitely further south. Wood betony. This is another great one. Blooms in the first part of spring, April and May. Sometimes you'll see it red, sometimes there's yellow. If you have a late cold spell, it'll turn the leaves red, like this really bright, beautiful red. I think that's just a stress response from the plant, but still, when you're hiking around, it looks pretty. Now, this is pretty short, does not get very tall, a foot and a half at most. Jacob's ladder, Pulmonium reptans. Arkansas blue star, Amsonia hubrechtii. So there's a few different species of Amsonia that grow here in northwest Arkansas. This one, this common name, has Arkansas in it. Amsonia tabernaemontana, eastern blue star. My understanding of that the species name tabernaemontana is it comes from the Tabernacle Mountain, something to do with that biblical story. Now, this is a native species here to North America. I don't think it grows in the Old World, so I'm not sure how that name gets applied. But you'll see that tabernaemontana species name used in other plants too, and I'm not entirely sure why, but the story behind that is it's tied back to an Old Testament story. Eastern redbud, Circus canadensis. This is not my circus. This is a picture I took somewhere. I've got one chuckle out there. Not my monkeys, not my circus, right? But anyway, nonetheless, great for other pollinators. Blooms in April. One of the first trees. It's an understory tree. One of the first things to bloom here in the Ozarks. Usually about a week or two before the dogwoods are blooming. A lot of times their bloom periods will overlap. Now this last year, we had such a warm winter, these things bloomed an entire month and a half early. It was the earliest I've ever seen redbuds bloom in like early March, and it was just shocking. But normally it's April. In the pea family, the flowers taste like sweet peas. They're delicious. You can eat them as long as you don't have an allergy to legumes. And then it produces these green pea pods, which in my personal opinion don't taste as good as the flower, so I don't tend to forage those. But definitely a beautiful species, and when you're hiking around before the leaves start being produced on the trees, you can see these from far away when they're in bloom. It's a great time of year to go hiking. Wild geraniums, Geranium maculatum. So April and May, again, can handle more shade, but can still grow in sunny areas. And one of our native geraniums. There's another one, Geranium carolinum, that likes full sun. People consider a little bit more weedy. It will grow in a lot of yards and lawns and whatnot. And but this one, a little bit more of a specialized species as far as its conservation value, a little bit higher because it signifies a more developed habitat than the Geranium carolinum. Wild bergamot, you mentioned the monardas. This is one of the purple-flowered monardas, Monarda fistulosa. Now this is a species that if you're growing it, make sure it has plenty of airflow around it. If it's too crowded and it doesn't get enough airflow, it is prone to get a powdery mildew on there. So if you do collect the leaves to want to make your own Earl Grey tea by using this as a bergamot substitute with some black tea, don't collect it if you see that white powdery substance on there. Would not be good. But if you do see it on there, don't fret. I mean, I leave it on my plants, to be honest with you. I don't really fool with it. And the plants seem to do fine. The flower, it just doesn't look as nice. So depending on what you're going for, you may. I don't have a good suggestion of how to fight it. Somebody else might, other than my understanding is just due to the humidity, and so trying to keep enough airflow around it sometimes will help. Where I have it growing, it is usually a little bit more shady, and so that could be why. And plus, I let things tend to go wild out at my place, and so it probably, those two combined, it just is prone to the powdery mildew. Spotted bee balm, Monarda punctata, blooms a little bit later, June and July. No, sorry. Okay, yeah, this is July through September. This one's going to be a little bit earlier. There's another one, Monarda bradburyiana, that blooms earlier in April and May, and it's much shorter. Didn't list it in here, but spotted bee balm, you can see it has that stacked flower formation, a little bit different than the Monarda fistulosa, but also another one that you can take the leaves. They have a very aromatic scent and make tea with it. Pale purple coneflower. Generally likes these full sun areas, can sometimes handle partial shade. These are if you see one, you know that soil is very fully developed with all kinds of fungal mycorrhizal, and it has not had much disturbance, and it's a good indicator. It's got a reasonably high conservation value or C value. Hairy Phacelia hiserta, another short, blooms in the spring, April through June. Lead plant, this is going to be a shrub, so it likes wet habitats, although I have seen people grow it in drier areas. And so, there are some species like swamp milkweed in the wild. It grows in wetlands, wet areas, does not compete well in upland areas, but if you have it in a landscaping setting where you are removing its competition and helping it out, some of these species can grow just fine in an upland area, especially if they're getting enough water. But say like bald cypress, so we see bald cypress trees, which in the wild grow in bottomland forests, right, swamps. But we see these also planted in parking lots and whatnot in upland areas. Well, why is that? Well, in the forest, when they drop their seeds, those things are made to float and they get carried to the edge, and when water levels recede, they get deposited in these wet areas, and there they're able to germinate and form new bald cypress trees. If you drop that thing on dry ground, it's not going to have the condition it needs to germinate. But if you can recreate those conditions in a greenhouse, you can get something started and then transplant it to an upland area. So sometimes we see in landscape settings wetland plants looking out of place, but there's different reasons for that. Some wetland plants like cattails, you can try to stick those in an upland area all you want. They're not going to do well. But this is one here that will do well in a more drier habitat than where it likes to be in the wild. Tall thistle, Cirsium altissimum. We do have several species of native thistle. This is different than the musk thistle or Russian thistle that is the bane of ranchers and cattle farmers. One way you can tell the difference between them if you come across them is the undersides of many of our native thistles have a white underside, and the little spines aren't as pokey. They have a little more flex to them. They might still poke just a little bit, but we say they're friendlier than that non-native thistle, which, if you grab that leaf, you're going to be shouting. But so these are a little nicer. These are also in bloom right now, and they also are one that seem to be pretty drought resistant. Past few years, when we've had these really dry spells in the summertime, this, along with the ironweed, will still continue to bloom. Giant ironweed, Vernonia gigantea. So one of the ironweeds that can handle a little bit more shade, but like the other ironweeds, will bloom in the second half of summer, August and September. All right, so again, another plug for the Wild Native Plant Sale. There are the details. If you want to acquire any of the species I talked about or any others, you can show up and see the vendors and what they have in their inventory. And then if you want to follow more with the Wild Ones Ozark chapter, you can follow us on Facebook. If you're on Facebook, facebook.com/OzarkWildOnes. We post all kinds of articles related to native plants. We announce our events or create these Facebook events for our different workshops. We're also on Instagram, not quite as active on Instagram or TikTok. We do have TikTok. We're trying to be cool and hip and attract a younger audience. I don't know if we're doing it. And then YouTube. We started right before the pandemic, so what did we have to do? Well, we had to pivot because everybody's virtual, and of course everybody's watching webinars. We didn't have Zoom exhaustion at that point, right? So we provided a lot of webinars, and those were recorded and placed on our YouTube channel. So, and then our national organization also has a YouTube channel. So I would say if you go onto YouTube and you just type in Wild Ones, you're going to get a lot of really different results than what you're looking for. So I recommend you type in Wild Ones channel or Wild Ones Ozark chapter to find the stuff that's going to be a little bit less spring break in Cancun, So anyway, and then of course to join, members.wildones.org/join, and then our chapter website, ozark.wildones.org. So with that, any questions that I have not answered yet before I step off? Yes, ma'am.
I have a question, and I think Sarah's presentation touched on this a little bit, but just to clarify. So when all of these native plants go to seed or, not in bloom, do you do anything with them? And if you just leave them, what happens when everything blooms in the spring? Do you have patches of these dry, dead ones, or like, what does that look like?
Yeah, so different ways of going about that. I live outside of city limits. I'm not bound by any like landscaping ordinances or anything, so I just let everything go wild and have its natural processes, right? And so what I see is a lot of birds coming and eating the seeds of my coneflowers and landing on there and other stuff. If I don't, some people will cut them to, improve. There are things that we can do, and I'm sure Coleman will talk about it, and Sarah touched on it, that you can cut the stems different heights and create, bee nesting habitat, Now, if those seeds, if they're not eaten, you're not, deadheading them or anything like that, and they just fall, some of those will germinate, some will be eaten by critters, some will just get moldy and rot, Not everything is successful. That's why plants produce a lot of seeds. And then some seeds are meant to be transported by wind, like the milkweeds. That's why they have that white fluffy stuff. Willows, anything with that white fluffy stuff, the thistles is, that's to be wind transported. So I don't know if that answers your question but.
Well, whether you leave them alone or you cut them, the next season, what do they look like?
Gotcha. So I can tell you, they'll usually put up if it's a herbaceous species, it's going to have leaves at the ground, and then it'll send up a stalk, sometimes with leaves on it, and that will flower, and that thing grows each year. And then at the winter time, it dies. The plant's still alive, the roots underground. If it's a perennial, will come back the next year. But you'll have a dead stalk with the seed head that will stay, and eventually it might get knocked over, it might decompose, whatnot. So a new set of flower heads might come up. Now, if it's a woody species, that stuff persists throughout the winter, and so you're going to get new growth on last year's growth as it expands, and those will have new flowers, and the old stems will still maybe produce flowers and leaves depending on the species and its growth patterns.
Okay.
Does that?
Like I have some, I think they're the black-eyed Susans.
Yes.
And they got so tall they just kind of flopped over.
Okay.
So do I just leave them flopped over, or do I cut them?
That could be due to different things. So it could be that there's too much nutrients, like especially if you've added any fertilizer or compost or things like that. It's like putting it on steroids, and so it grows too tall, because native plants they are evolved or adapted to nutrient deficient soils, wild soils, right? That that aren't agricultural soils. Or it could be that it's not getting enough light. If it's getting too much shade, then it's trying to stretch out, getting leggy in order to access more light. I have that issue with where I planted some royal catchfly, is it tends to grow, flop over, and then starts to continue to grow, and then once it gets enough light, it starts to grow up again. But where I put it, which wasn't ideal, I thought it was at the time, it turned out it wasn't, still does just fine, produces seeds, flowers, everything. It just doesn't look all nice. It just kind of sprawls a little bit and then comes up. So, that's one thing.
That makes sense.
You could put a tomato cage around them.
Yeah, there you go.
Give them some support.
Yeah,
Or some
trellis.
stakes and some string around the outside, give them a little bit of, hold them up a little bit if they do it that way.
Okay.
Especially if it's a
That's
nutrient issue,
Yeah, which I think it is.
Growing bad, and then you can cut it
And they'll keep
2/3,
growing,
and it'll keep growing.
and
Yeah.
it'll grow. Okay.
And that's especially with like the species that bloom later in the summer. If you cut those, not cut them too low, but it'll send out lateral growth, and it actually improves its flowering, increases its flowering, especially like the asters, anything in the aster family. And then sometimes you can even do a second cut, and what I've been advised is have your second cut by Memorial Day, and then that will then send out even more lateral growth, and so you end up with a more robust, more in bloom species. It's going to be a little bit shorter than its natural counterpart, but when you're improving, increasing the flowering, well, that's even benefiting pollinators more, right? Now, I don't know if all species are like that. I know I've been told this with a lot of the asters. Lissa Morrison, wonderful resource. She used to work at Botanical Garden of the Ozarks. We have some of her webinars on our YouTube channel and some plant lists that she created on our website. She was one of our founding chapter members. She's more retired from the public eye, more so these years, but still, if you can find, if she ever comes out of retirement and gives another talk, go to that talk. So she's been landscaping with native plants since the 70s, before it was this new wave of popularity that it's gained.
And when would I do the first cut by? If
So,
I was gonna do that.
Kitty recommends with some of the plants to cut them in mid-June. Like your milkweed and stuff like that, you can cut them back and sometimes you get a second bloom. And Kitty works with the botanical gardens in the butterfly house. But the other thing that I have found is I do the cutback in the fall just to do cleanup some, because some of my plants grow huge. And so I'll cut some of those back, but then Carter likes to leave stems for the insects, so maybe we'll have stuff sticking up that looks like this. And then in mid-spring, or the latter part of spring, I cut those back too. And also, that's when I pick up my leaves, if I'm gonna do some if I'm not gonna leave them for the violets. So it also depends on which plants you put in. And that's one of the things I would recommend the most. I wish I had learned more about the individual plants that I put in before I put them in. Another thing that I'm finding out is that there's some of them that it's better if you transplant. And after 2 or 3 years, they start to not look the same. They spread out more and more, and you want to take part of it out and move it, either share plants with other people or, so like I said, a lot of it has to really be learning about what it is you're putting in.
Yeah.
I wish I had done more of that. I started just immediately because I was all excited about it.
and so be aware too of when it blooms, so that mid-June, if it's something where that's, wrapping up its bloom period, that might harm that. I mean, I think the reason I was told late May, early June, Memorial Day-ish, was because a lot of times right after that's when it starts drying up. Sometimes we will have, a wet June, but if it starts drying up, then, things probably aren't. I mean, and of course, I guess it too makes a difference if you're planting to water throughout the summer. So that might be a factor in it as well.
That's helpful. That gives me some parameters.
Sometimes you can get a second bloom when you
Right.
get back, it just gets all pretty again. It's just not as tall.
My cone flowers are cute, pretty right now.
Yeah,
I had them when they were ugly.
Yeah, I think, was it deadheading? Is that what that's called? I believe, yeah. So when you see that in the literature, that's why. So,
I deadhead them, but then they're just like a hot mess. So then I just cut them, I'll leave about that much.
Okay.
And then right now they're all puffy and cute.
Nice. Yeah. My coneflowers did not do well this year, I'll tell you that. So, yeah, they, as soon as they got dry, they stopped.
Depending on the weather, you get different results
Yeah.
every year, depending on what you've got in there.
Yeah, and the timing of the rains and and the droughts, it seemed like some years, even out in nature, certain species, that year might favor that species, and other years might favor other species, just how it gets timed and cycles and all that. I know with black-eyed Susans, they're also either biennials or short-lived perennials, so they might, they're going to be dropping seeds, but they'll be more shifty on the landscape from year to year, so they might not last, indefinitely as many other perennials might last, several more years or 20 years or a lot longer, but those are a little bit shorter lived.
And I'd say another thing is check what kind of roots they have, because if you've got things that have tap roots, they tend to come back every year. The spring is really exciting because you see them coming back up. But if you have things that have rhizomes, they could sometimes spread like crazy, and they're not always easy to, they're better in a pot sometimes than they are in the ground.
Yeah, Asclepias syriaca is one of those rhizomatous species, or ashy sunflower, and it will spread and take over an area, and that's the one like you're talking about where you could go in and take some out, and you're not going to harm that plant. It's going to be just fine. And maybe plant some over here or over there, or give it away or something like that.
Yeah, one of the things you mentioned that Lissa Morrison has, it probably on the website, is her list of well-behaved plants.
Yeah.
Because most of the mints spread pretty fast, and where the obedient plant is obedient for moving around, it's not obedient for growth. It goes crazy.
Yeah. The mints, you got to knock them back every few years. If anything in the mint family, a lot of times, once it starts getting out of control, it will just tend to take over. So, depending on what else is there and habitat and all that. All right. Well, in the interest of time, I'm going to turn it over to Coleman.
Sorry.
No, no apologies needed.
Caught in traffic on the way up, but no, looks like that's going to go pretty quick. Beautiful library. Just want to say that. This is a wonderful facility. All right. So, my name is Coleman Little. I research native bees with University of Arkansas, as well as I'm a lecturer at the University of Central Arkansas. And I've just been trying to figure out what bees we have in Arkansas, and getting pretty close to having a decent idea of that. But as you know, I'm working on this. We're also looking at ways to conserve them, promote them, and I think that kind of understanding the biology of bees is really important to kind of understanding what we're doing with their habitat as we are trying to manage for them. So, I mean, I'm sure people in here know why you should care about bees, but just to make sure that we state it, it's mostly because plants, a good portion of plants, around 78% in our region, are going to require some form of animal-mediated pollination, whether that just be simply to promote gene flow, but some species it is just outright to reproduce. Now, it's different wherever you're at. Some tropical areas, some islands, I don't have that on. That number goes up to 98%. So some areas it is even more important than here. And bees, they just tend to be exceptional pollinators wherever they are at. They are not always the most dominant or most prominent, but they certainly tend to be across multiple habitats. They've been shown to increase seed set, crop yields, just pollination efficiency in general. And it's very easy to apply those crop yields to wildlife. I mean, it's food production. If we're creating more food for wildlife, it's just better for these ecosystems. Okay, so here's the challenge for kind of managing for native bees. Right? You've got to get past what you typically think of when you think of bees. Right? So if you think of bees and you were thinking honey, a hive, and a queen bee, that is extremely strange for a bee. So there we're talking about the European honeybee, Apis mellifera, and it's very bizarre. There are not very many bees that behave like a honeybee, but our attention on honeybees is, I mean, there's obvious reasons why. I mean, Bee Movie was interesting, but they have these flashy swarms. We have a lot of products. Honey and wax in general is great, whatever that guy is doing. There's just a lot of attention around honeybees. And they're really wonderful in agricultural settings. But this attention that they ended up getting with colony collapse disorder, that was like back in around 2010 where this really ramped up. Our attention seemed to have shifted to focusing on honeybees But the bees that were really in trouble are our native bees, not so much the honeybees. Okay, so what are these kind of native bees, your non-honeybees? Well, a lot of us know bumblebees, and quite frankly, bumblebees are one of the few groups that is kind of similar to a honeybee, right? And we don't have that many species here in Arkansas. They're pretty prominent, they're all over the place, but we don't have a ton of diversity, okay? A lot of people, usually with some cuss words, might mention, say, carpenter bees. These are ones, this is the eastern carpenter bee, Xylocopa virginica. It is the one that will actually bore into lumber and can be, it's at least viewed as a pest. The extent of that damage is not exactly clear, but we have native species that don't bore into lumber, as well as this one. No matter what, they're phenomenal pollinators. And then we often will hear people mention sweat bees, which is a huge term. That honestly describes this whole family of Halictidae that is really diverse. There's a lot of different of those bees. You wouldn't call most of them sweat bees, right? And so sweat bee to us basically just kind of means small metallic bee. Well, here are 3 bees and 3 different families of bees, all kind of fitting that description: small, metallic, and shiny. And so I don't really find sweat bee to be that great of a term. I use them for I say sweat bee to refer to a very specific group of halictids. Teeny tiny, they're the ones that accidentally sting you when they get caught in your sweat. And they're really just trying to find salt. It's hard to come by in nature occasionally. They go to your sweat. It's so humid here in Arkansas, they just kind of get wrapped up in our sweat, freak out thinking that they're going to die, and then sting you. And that's why those are called sweat bees. A lot of bees in that family are far too large for that and don't get attracted to sweat. So I don't like it as a term. But if we just kind of take our general understanding, the public's understanding of bees, which is typically honeybees and bumblebees. There's 7 species of honeybees and just about 250 species of bumblebees worldwide. That makes this portion, which is a tiny fraction of the total number of bee species that exist. There are over 20,000, but using the conservative estimate of 20,000 bee species, that is just a tiny fraction of what bees are. And like I said, most bees are not even remotely like all of those bees that are in that top portion. So why care about these non-honeybee bees? Well, they do show those increased crop yields, right? And all the research tends to be in agriculture because that's where the funding for that research comes from, but it is easy to apply that to wildlife as just, like I said before, food production for the wildlife itself. So some studies, and you'll see this contradictory thing brought up occasionally, some studies show no increase. It's just kind of neutral whether increasing the number of native bees actually increases yield. But that is more of an indication of just how complicated pollination systems really are. And I will get into that a little bit more in a minute. But first, what is a bee? It's honestly kind of hard to define. It's a major group of Hymenoptera that includes your ants, wasps, velvet ants, and the odd one in the group, sawflies, a really interesting group. The technical difference are characteristics of the pronotum, which is basically the neck, and the pronotal lobe, which is that piece right there. It's hard to explain. It's the curvature and where it sits relative to the rest of the plates. I don't typically look at that. You usually just kind of, they look like a bee over time, but that is the technical difference. So what you're going to find with bees is there is scopa present on most of them. Now, most is definitely a word that I use all too often because there's way too many exceptions in bees. Like I said, they're not like honeybees, most of them. So scopa is the structure that they carry pollen in, and on this bee, it is these hairy legs. Now, that scopa could be in different parts of the body, But for instance, males of all species don't have scopa. Right? So literally just the male component of literally every single species, there's no scopa. But there are even bee species that the female does not have scopa. There are parasitic bees that don't actively collect pollen, even though they do transfer pollen. And then there's a group of bees that, rather than carrying pollen on their hind legs, they store it in their crop, much like a bird, gathering food to regurgitate to their young. They store it internally. And they still manage to pollinate when they do so. Another thing is females are going to have a modified ovipositor that we call a stinger. Again, that's most. There's a whole group, it's a couple different genera in South America that are known as stingless bees. And they don't have any stingers whatsoever. But again, this is also females have stingers. An ovipositor is something that you lay eggs with. And male bees aren't going to be laying eggs, so they don't have this structure, right? So it is really hard to tack down what a bee really is. It technically is just that pronotum and pronotal lobe differentiation, which can be a little frustrating, right? So all in all, what we're talking about, we call this group Anthophylla. That includes 7 families of bees. 1 family is only found in Australia. The rest can be found in North America. Overall, we have currently, like a firm count, 443 genera and over 20,000 species. I see that number get as high as 26,000 occasionally. Most of these are going to be very strict vegetarians, okay, at least to our understanding. And what that really means is the majority or all of their diet is going to be coming from pollen and nectar. And they aren't going to be supplementing it with other things, but there are bees in Panama that will collect carrion, rotting flesh, and add that to their pollen and nectar mixture. And there's even one in Southeast Asia that apparently collects proteins in mammal tears and will actively collect that as a nutrient source. So again, there are exceptions to just about all of this, okay? So, as we've seen, the structure of the flower that they might be going to can be very, very different. And here is really just the 2 extremes. You have a composite flower and your lily, just a very large single flower. The way that a pollinator is going to interact with one of those will be entirely different from the other. Okay, and ultimately, this is why it's hard to figure out, will native bees increase your crop yield? Because it kind of depends on what your flower is for your crop. It's very, very complicated. If we look more at these flowers, I mean, imagine where they are keeping their pollen, where they are keeping their nectar. The bees aren't just actively trying to pollinate, they're gathering resources. So they're gathering pollen, they're gathering nectar to feed to their young, they just happen to transfer pollen along the way. And so the way a bee or any pollinator is going to interact with this passion flower, right, is going to kind of dictate how effective transferring that pollen is going to be. And then there's even other examples like solanum, tomato right there. But all solanum species require, might not want to say that, most solanum species require what is called buzz pollination, or sonication is the term I like to use, where they will actively they bite down on a tube that's in the flower structure, and they will vibrate at a very specific frequency, and it is only at that frequency that the flower will release pollen. And then they collect it, and that's the only way a lot of these nightshades are actually pollinated. And interestingly, a lot of insects have been documented buzz pollinating, flies, there's been some wasps, tons of bees. Apis mellifera, the European honeybee, has never once been documented buzz pollinating. So just kind of looking at some native bees to look at how they're interacting with these flowers. This is a longhorn bee, that's a bumblebee, another longhorn bee. These are leafcutter bees. you see they carry their pollen on the underside of their abdomen. And as they are moving across the flower, you can see, I mean, they're dragging it across those flowers. A very, very close connection there. And that is going to differ a lot more. Look at this honeybee going to this hibiscus. The nectar is very detached from the pollen. That's not a very effective pollination interaction. And just imagine with all the variation that you might have in flowers, all the different ways that these bees are carrying pollen, it is really hard to kind of tackle what is the increase in pollination efficiency. But absolutely, increasing the diversity of your native bees is going to increase the diversity of this interaction. And overall is just going to help with pollination in your areas. I'll go ahead and mention this. Bumblebees and honeybees are what we call corbiculate bees, and that just means that their scopa is a bare patch on their hind leg. It's surrounded by hair. But the way they carry their pollen is they mix it with nectar, and they make a Play-Doh type looking substance that they just stick in that corbicula. They are native. Our other native bees are just going to have hair that they just kind of stuff the pollen in. This is called wetted pollen, and some other native species wet the pollen as they do it, but as soon as it goes in that Play-Doh form, that pollen is not transferring to a flower. That pollen has been collected. It will not pollinate. What will pollinate is the pollen that is on their face and other parts of their body. But with these, some of that pollen can brush off with the ones that aren't actively wetting their pollen. There's also some interesting examples. This one is from Arizona, just the Chihuahuan Desert out there. And it really highlights just some of the stuff that we're starting to learn about bees. This is Tiloglossa arizonensis. It is a specialist on the silverleaf nightshade. Actually, I guess I have that. And it sonicates it. It requires that buzz pollination. And we thought for a while, maybe that pollen is just loaded with nutrients because there's not very much coming out of the flower when they're sonicating it. That was our assumption. We also know that they would gather nectar from agave, tons of nectar held in those flowers. Bats typically go to them. That's these flowers over here. And so we thought that that was pretty much it. There wasn't anything else to it. They're just mixing those together, and they make this liquidy pollen sort of provision. However, do I have that on the next one? There we go. We now know that they cultivate lactobacillus bacteria in that mixture. So they are actively growing a bacteria to consume it for a source of nitrogen. Right? So they aren't even requiring pollen for their entire protein in their diet. They're growing something to eat it, right? So it's becoming more complex as we start to pay attention to this. We started looking at gut microbes of a lot of different bees, and lactobacillus seems to be kind of common in a bunch of them. So there might be many other bees that are doing this on top of collecting pollen. And again, this paper was published. That picture is from a different paper. Us knowing that they are cultivating lactobacillus was 2 years ago. So we are just now kind of learning that is a thing, and I would assume we're going to find that more common in other bees. So understanding if you're like really trying to enhance a pollinator community or just bees in general, I really think that we just kind of need to understand their overall biology. And with bees, that really comes down to their social behavior, their foraging range, and then the presence of different flowering species. And with that, and I think Eric did a wonderful job with this, the time of year that you have flowers is really, really important. And if you are really trying to go for a really good pollinator habitat, you're going to want to have flowers for as much of the year as you can. Right, so bees are very diverse in their behaviors. We are typically familiar with the eusocial behavior, and that is what bumblebees and honeybees have. Eusocial, or I guess I sometimes see this as advanced eusocial, involves a queen that doesn't really leave. With bumblebees, some of them will do a little bit of foraging, but it's mostly the workers that forage. The queen lays the eggs, and then there are males. In honeybees, the males are fairly worthless. In bumblebees, they pollinate. They are out on the flowers. They are transferring pollen from one flower to another. And in some species, I've heard reports that they can kind of guard the nest because most things can't differentiate between a male and a female bee. However, the term eusocial actually came from Suzanne Batra, and she was describing what we now refer to as primitively eusocial. Primitively eusocial bees, there is not a distinct queen. There is just a female that tends to lay more eggs than everyone else. And some of the documentation on this is pretty entertaining. It seems that she's just a bully that runs around literally pushing and nudging the other bees that are collecting pollen. And they'll collectively lay, 10 to 30% of the eggs in a colony, and just that one bully will take over laying most of the eggs. But there's no way to look at them and tell the difference between a queen and a worker with these. And then there's subsocial, which is one of my favorite examples. These, they just decide. They emerge, kind of evaluate what the resources look like, and they're either going to just be solitary and on their own, or they will form a very small, primitively eusocial community. But it's really individual by individual on whether they form that or not. You see that is roughly about 4% of bee species. It is a pretty rare one, not as rare as semisocial though. And I've seen this term kind of go back and forth. This is what our eastern carpenter bees are. I refer to them as communists. They live in a commune. They all actively collect pollen for everyone. They all actively protect the colony. And they'll even share nesting cavities. So they just kind of form these groups that are actively working together, and no female is laying noticeably more eggs than the others. Parasitic, these are some of my favorite bees. They just look cool. But it's often confusing to hear parasite when I'm talking about being an herbivore. What a parasitic bee does is it lays its egg in another species' nest. The egg hatches, eats that other species' provision, and then will emerge. Some of these parasites you never see on flowers, but that's honestly kind of rare. Most of these are pretty active on the flowers and are still doing a lot of pollination. And there's even a subcategory of this, your social parasite. There are bumblebees that will kill the queen and hijack the whole hive and have the other species workers collecting pollen for them. They're pretty rare. They're really neat. I've never actually caught one. But they do exist, and we should have 3 species here in Arkansas. And then, the majority of them, around 70%, are going to be solitary, and that is just them doing everything on their own. They will often nest in aggregations, right? But we don't really know, do they prefer to live together, or is the resource that they are nesting in, is that clustered? We don't really know. It's probably one or the other, depending on the species. And then I really like the communal form of solitary. Think of this like an apartment building. Everybody is using the entrance and the elevator shaft, but then you're responsible for your own space within it. So there's one entrance, a tunnel that just branches off into individuals' own space that they are making nests in. So again, a huge diversity in their social behavior. And what they are doing is they are working on their nests. Okay, so honeybees are they're basically active. If it's warm enough, they'll be out flying, looking for things. Most of our native bees do not do that. They are going to, and this can vary depending on the species, how they overwinter, and this is just an example from a single species. But the adult will be out active collecting pollen, and is going to collect everything that its offspring needs to develop from an egg into a pupa. Right, so some species will go into a pupa, then overwinter. This one is going to go into what we call a pre-pupa, and then it will pupate as soon as it starts to warm up, then emerge as an adult. But the challenge here is this adult is sealing off all of these resources, and it has to be enough. It can't have too much fungal growth. You have to worry about water regulation. These are living organisms, so they're going to be pooping and peeing. All that waste has to be dealt with. And so it's pretty remarkable that they are able to kind of withstand all of that. But it's also something to keep in mind, specifically the fungal growth. Right? If you have an area that might be great for native bees to nest, if it's too wet, it might not actually work for that particular species, just having to fight off fungus. So when they make these nests, there's a huge variation in how they do it. The pollen provision, we mentioned the liquid one. These are entertaining because the larva will actually swim around, stir up the pollen before it actually starts consuming it. Some will make a little perfect little sphere of pollen. I would say this is more typical of what you would see for most of them, but you can see in this diagram, there's a lot of variation. Some, to avoid fungal growth, will actually even make the pollen provision into a tripod so that as little of it is touching the sides as is possible. This is a cactus specialist that just tends to throw a bunch of pollen and a bunch of eggs into one spot, and whoever eats the most pollen wins. And I say wins, gets larger. The species that do that tend to have huge amounts of size variation. A lot of bees are going to need a lot more than just the flowers and floral resources. These are your leafcutter bees, but there are other bees that need other things as well. Right, but you will see sometimes even these little circular cuts out of leaves. It's very distinctive around here. If you see a lot of that, that's a leafcutter bee. And they are taking that, they're going to roll it up, and this is a single nest pod. And so they're going to roll it up, make a capsule that's where they're storing the pollen and the egg. We assume these need antimicrobial properties. Redbud, I definitely noticed leafcutter bees doing this a lot too. Muscadines. There's a few different things, and in a very cute way, these bees have also been observed doing this to flower petals and using the petals as the inner lining of the nest. No idea why, but it's cute. All right. So now where they're nesting, all right? And this is really important because you can provide a bunch of floral resources. They need a place to nest as well. So tunnel nesting is mostly going to be, say, your leafcutter bees. Talk about those in a little bit. Some bore into dead wood. We really have 2 species in Arkansas, only 1 species here, and that's the eastern carpenter bee. The vast majority are nesting in the soil. Definitely 70% are constructing a nest in the soil. If you include the parasitic ones that are also just kind of parasitizing ones that are in the soil, that goes up to about 90% of bee species are in the soil. Our cavity nesters are our eusocial things, honeybees and bumblebees here. This is a stingless bee hive, and that's just up there just to kind of show you what some of the differences look like. Bumblebees need an empty rodent den, whereas honeybees typically need a little bit larger of a cavity to actually set up in. And then one that was already mentioned a bit, pith nesters. These are the ones that you would be leaving the stems behind for. They are actually carpenter bees. These little tiny things are carpenter bees like this. They're just not big enough to really bore into dead wood, so they're boring into herbaceous stems. Then again, there's exceptions. There are exceptions to everything. This video is actually of an invasive species, but I don't have this for the natives that exist here as well. But we have carter bees that will, in different ways, take plant shavings and construct an external nest. Just kind of stick it on a leaf, right? And you can really see what this is for if you are in an area where maybe the soil is wet, but the air is dry. Doing this will allow you to dry out effectively and not have too much fungal growth. We have, it's Dianthidium, it's a similar genus, that will do this with mud and pebbles in this area. So there's definitely exceptions, and that's just a pretty neat one. One of the native ones will actually take shavings of iris or lily species and do this with just fiber shavings. So back to soil, though. It even gets more complicated than just in the soil. There's obviously a lot going on here, but it is looking at the soil preference of different species. Right, this is a soil triangle or pyramid showing percent clay, silt, and sand down here. The majority of your bees that nest in the soil are going to prefer a more sandy mix, but none of them like just sand. All right, they like a combination of these different things, but the combination that they prefer, it even varies. Some of them will take a wider range of these, others are more specific. Right? But when creating a pollinator habitat, having diversity in your soil in terms of silt, clay, and sand will help you encourage more of a diversity in your bees. Yes? Yeah.
I imagine the reason they avoid just pure sand is because it's usually not very cohesive. It just caves in.
Yeah, that's exactly it. And the sandy loam is just the right combination where you have structure and drainage. And so yeah, the one that does the lactobacillus bacteria only in sandy loam, and it needs those. It's a desert species, so it can be a little more picky, but yeah, some are very, very particular, and we're just starting to figure this out. But that is why they don't like sand, clay. I hardly ever see any up here that really like a ton of clay, but some do prefer a decent amount of clay. There is one that would land maybe in this region, but that's besides the point. The depth that they're actually making these also varies greatly. Okay, this is just a single genus that's represented here, all soil nesting, but you can see some of them are very restricted. They're very shallow in the nests that they're constructing, and there's hardly any variation. They nest at that depth. Then there are some species, it's just all over the place. And we don't really know why. They might just be going, like, say, down to the water table, and maybe that's different elsewhere. But the data that we have shows there's a huge range, and then sometimes there's not. But certainly you can't necessarily just aim for a depth and it just be consistent for all bees. They're all going to be nesting at different depths, and they're making very different nests when they're doing that, right? We don't know how they structure a lot of these, but every time we look, each species seems to have a different construction to how they are actually piecing everything together. Here's some other examples. You'll just find a lot of different combinations. Like I said, each time we look, it does seem to be a little bit different. Now, I have seen, this is from Sam Droege, and he has started trying out these native bee soil sort of nest promotions, and he's had pretty good success. These are all bee nests, and he's just using different combinations of clay, silt, sand. I think he puts some like grass clippings in some of these to give it a little bit more structure, but he's been playing around with them. And this is really the first time to really just kind of warn about this. He got a little ambitious, and he basically made this wall of this clay mixture that worked so well for him. The birds decimated all of the bees that were nesting in it, right? So whenever you're doing like these sort of habitats, keep in mind, if it gets to a certain size, you're really just attracting a ton of predators. We want some of these things to be eaten by predators. That's wildlife. Part of the function of bees is to provide food for wildlife. But we don't want them all wiped out. And so I would recommend, if you want to do something like this, to use several different small ones, scatter them around. If a predator finds one, wonderful. It has some food, and then the rest of the population can kind of persist around it. These are our dead wood borers. This one, southern half of the state, it's beautiful. The male is green and has a bunch of orange. I love that bee. It doesn't bore into lumber. It's wonderful. This is the one everyone gets annoyed with. And it is making these galleries on the inside of wood. Someone's deck is going to have that, and then they're just kind of making the individual, like each one of those cells is going to contain a pollen provision and an egg. Right? Pith borers. So these are the ones that go into your dead herbaceous stems. Right? When you're talking Arkansas, you're mostly talking about these Ceratina species. Itty bitty, green, metallic. A lot of people would call these sweat bees. And I've started just cracking open stems. It seems they will go into just about any stem that's kind of left from last year, anything from rubus even. It doesn't actually have to be herbaceous, but liatris, coneflowers, any of those stems they will nest in. And this is where you get recommendations on leaving some stem behind, which is wonderful. It helps them overwinter. If you can, it is best to leave these as long as you can. They use these throughout the year. And these are ones where a female will kind of form something of a eusocial network. And it just kind of grows and gets bigger and bigger throughout the year. And then just a few of them will overwinter in the stems. Yes?
Are these the kind that will produce like galls on goldenrod stems?
No. So actually interesting, when I started cracking open goldenrod specifically, there are so many things that use those stems. But that is a very specific, I think it's just called the goldenrod gall wasp. And it makes that very characteristic bulb. That's what's doing that. And honestly, that would be disruptive to these bees. But I mean, I typically find at least 10 species of insect when I crack these things open. That they get a lot of usage. Some of them are invasive species, but that's besides the point. I'm sure there's a native that would have loved to be using it. And so, yeah, the more stem you can leave behind, the better. Right? The longer you can leave it, the better. But there's obviously, I mean, as discussed, there's a balance, right, between making things look nice, keeping things clean, preventing certain types of growth, and helping to promote these, right? And so it's just the more you can do, the better. And I would honestly think if you could leave some stems kind of propped up maybe against the side of a building, that they might still get some usage. We don't know that, but potentially. So tunnel nesters these are your leaf cutter bees, resin bees. They really just need a cavity, tunnel-shaped cavity that is big enough for their requirements. They often just use exit holes from other insects out of, say, wood, but interstitial spaces in rock piles, things like that. I actually pulled one out from in between a brick wall and a rain gutter once. So if they can construct it there, they will, okay? That obviously wasn't a great spot, especially being on a bee scientist's house, but it didn't really provide all that much protection either. And so they're gonna want it fairly well protected, fairly dry. If it's really wet, these tend to not like it as much. And what they're doing inside of those tunnels, it varies, all right? This is your leafcutter bee, and it just makes a pod or one cell just on top of another. And it will just keep making them, and she will just keep going as long as she can. I am nearly certain, we don't have evidence of this, but I'm nearly certain that a female could move from one habitat to another and construct a nest in each of those different habitats. They're certainly able to. There are also resin bees. This one specifically is invasive, but we have natives that do this as well. and they make a waterproof resin that they line their nests with. They look nearly identical to these leafcutter bees also, but they also have to include, like, say, a snorkel for air exchange with all of this. So it gets really elaborate. And then at the bottom, those are mason bees. You might have heard of the blue orchard bee, or just mason bees in general. They are collecting mud. Some of them mix it with plant fibers, kind of make an adobe. And some of the preferences here can be kind of funny. Some are capable of mixing dirt and water and making mud. Others, it has to be mud. They can't actually mix the two. So there's even a lot of variation there. These bee houses are what is being targeted, well, I said that weird. These bee houses are trying to attract these tunnel nesters, okay? But this slide really is to try to give you a little bit of caution. I pulled these off of Amazon. That's a honeybee, and honeybees would not go to this structure. I would try to cue in on those sort of things, because the issue, if you were to, like, say, buy this one for Arkansas, the holes are too big. We don't have any species that would build a nest in that cavity. There will be some spiders, stuff like that, but not bees, not for here. These are also honeybees flying around this one. My complaint on this one, some of those holes are too big, but some of them are about right. It's the varnish on the wood. Try to avoid treated woods, varnishes, things like that, because that can leach into their nests as they're developing and trying to turn into an adult. We have some evidence, though it's not a lot, that suggests it might affect their size and when they emerge, things like that. So I recommend, these holes are still too big, it's just a picture, but I recommend just gathering wood from your property, drilling holes in it of different sizes, like just a range of sizes. You probably don't want to go any bigger than 3/8 of an inch drill bit, and just a bunch of different holes, and try to store that somewhere relatively dry. And again, you also don't want to do too much of this, because you don't want to draw in predators. But spreading them out, there's not a ton of information on what works great in Arkansas. And so just trying out multiple locations and seeing what happens is what I would recommend, especially if you aren't buying those houses and you're just kind of testing it out this way. It wouldn't be too expensive to do so. Cavity nesters, there's not much management really to do for this, especially for honeybees. You're just going to need a big cavity to nest in. But again, that's honeybees. This is more what a bumblebee nest would look like. Some of these hives are only about 20 workers. Right? So some of them can be pretty small. They can get up to, I believe, 80 is the largest that we've found. But they're just going to find an old rodent nest. And they make these pods that are kind of, it's a mixture of a waxy sort of substance, pollen and nectar. And they actually will actively feed the larvae throughout the year. We've started getting some evidence that maybe occasionally they will overwinter as a hive. There at least was some video evidence that emerged this year. It looked like a hive from the previous year that was waking up for the spring. But in general, bumblebees are the hive will die off, and then the female will hide somewhere, the queen will hide somewhere and overwinter that way, and just reset up a whole new hive each year. So now looking at their foraging range, it's real technical what we know about it. It's called intertegular span. These little pads above the wing are called tegula. It's basically how big is the bee. How wide apart is the wing base? Gives you a rough indication of the size of the bee. And when you consider the size range of bees, that really kind of sets in how different some of these ranges can be. This is Perdita minima. Might be, well, no, it is minima. Smallest bee in North America. Not quite the largest, but up there, and the largest in the United States. Very, very different flight capabilities. So the way I like to display this is not to scale. This is really just to kind of demonstrate. Say you're managing this garden area for bees. What's important about when you're looking at the bees and just think about their size, some of them, their entire range could be in your flower bed. And they're only going to go as far as they need to. Honestly, if you have enough floral resources, that giant bee might only stay in your garden the whole time if there's enough, right? But as far as capabilities go, those small bees, you might be in control of their entire world that they have access to. And it's very important to accommodate them. The ones that are slightly bigger, they might still be restricted to the habitat that you are managing. But then as they start to get a little bit larger, what is impacting them and what they have access to might start extending beyond your property. As we continue to grow in size, they might be pulling resources from very far away. You might not be in control of the nesting resources that are over here, but you're still supporting those bees with the flowers that you are managing in that area. And then for your really large ones, I mean, we don't really know how far a bee has foraged before. It's kind of hard to get that information, but we know that bees are capable of finding their home. The large carpenter bees can be taken about 71 miles away, and they will still fly back to their home. It's called a homing experiment. I don't know exactly what it means, but they're certainly capable of finding their nest upwards of 70 miles away. All right, so what should you do? Well, flower species diversity. And Eric did a wonderful job of hitting a lot of the flowers that are really good for bees or just pollinators in general. I will say, if you're ever just managing for one single thing, you're gonna be favoring it and the community is gonna shift. The best communities I see have tons of predators, tons of flowers that bees don't like. Just diversity that is present is typically reflected in your bees. And so just in general, the more diverse and complex you can make your flower community, as well as the nesting resources that are available, the more complex your bees are going to be, just in general, right? So looking at floral specialization, bees specialize kind of in different flowers, or maybe nectar, right? I mentioned that one that does the lactobacillus bacteria. It's pretty stringent. It goes to agave and that solanum. You don't really see it going anywhere else, but there's a wide variation, right? Sometimes we refer to bees as specialists. They're specializing in a family. That family is Asteraceae. That's your composite flowers. I mean, that is a massive amount, but we might still call them a specialist, right? Typically, when I say specialist, I'm referring to one that goes to a genus of flowers. The only time we see like species-specific specialization, it's like the only species of that genus in the area, right? Or maybe it's an invasive, they might not recognize it, but the norm for bees is to specialize in a genus, not necessarily a species. However, there's just kind of this unofficial tendency that we see with bees. A lot of bees definitely have a preference where they will either go to a composite flower, and they might generalize on all composites, but they're only going to the composites. And then others might just go to those single flowers and only those. And then you do have a few that go to both. Bumblebees, honeybees are a wonderful example. They will go to both. But most of these other bees, there at least is that preference that exists. And yeah, I've seen a lot of these specialist bees on wind pollinated flowers before. Caught the blueberry bee, as we call it, blueberry digger bee, sonicating, so buzz pollinating oak flowers. The things that just dangle in the trees, and that's pretty unusual. Basically, they're just going to get resources if they can find them, right? So when you do see specialization, however, those flowers tend to be preferred by a lot of different bees, and there's a lot of speculation as to why that might be. but I know purple prairie clover was mentioned. Bees love that, just in general. I don't know what it is, but it definitely draws in a lot of pollinators in general. But then there's even odd ones, like willow. Pollinators love willow. That looks wind pollinated to me. The pollen doesn't have a chance to hit the wind with the amount of pollinators that are on these trees. I encourage you to try to find one. They're hard to find because the flower's not showy, but they are typically swarming when they are flowering. And then like Oenothera, there's a lot of specialization in Oenothera. Mentioned nocturnal bee in one of the earlier talks. These Oenothera, some of them open at night. And so we are pretty sure that those nocturnal ones either do Oenothera or Ludwigia, which is a similar genus. So why are bees specializing? Basically, we don't know. That's the easy answer there. But I'll highlight why we don't know. This is not from North America, but this bee, its genus is named after the genus of the flower that it goes to, and we have only ever observed it going to this Nolana species. Okay, just a really intimate specialization with that plant, apparently. Well, now we've done a lot of phylogenetic work. When did these things come into existence? And we found out, you can see that is the only species of that genus of bee. We found out that that bee evolved about 67 million years ago, right? Been a while. There's been a few people working on the history of bees. This one was pretty interesting, but then they compared it like, well, I wonder how long ago that flower evolved. It was 10 million years ago. And so the issue here is, what was this bee feeding on for 55 million years? We have no idea. We don't know if, say, that Nolana shows up and it's just better and they left what they were going to for it, or if their thing that they preferred went extinct and then they had to shift to something else. We genuinely don't know. This is something that we are trying to figure out. But just the short of that is specialization is a preference with bees, from what we can tell. There's a few African species where that is not true. They are tied to that plant. But for bees as a whole, it just seems to be a preference. What are they wanting to go to? What do they seem to be getting the most nutrients from? As I'm out collecting bees, I will notice a species only going to one flower, say this year, but last year they were only going to a different flower. And so there's still a lot of that we are trying to figure out. This is a complicated graph, but no, it does show some good stuff. So on both sides, we've got 2 different years. Plant species are on the left side. Bee species are on the right. This is from Europe. And there is a line connecting a bee to a plant if it was observed pollinating that flower. It's organized, I keep pressing that button. That's what I just said. It is organized where the plants that are at the bottom were visited by less different pollinators. And then the ones at the top had more different pollinators. Bees, the exact same way. The ones at the bottom visited less different flowers. You can see all the ones at the bottom only have one line coming off of them. And then the one at the top is the biggest generalist, and it just kind of is there in between. So the things to look at here, one, there's only a few instances where there is a bee and a plant, and that is the only interaction. Most of these plants that only have one pollinator, that pollinator is the generalist, or one of the top generalists. We often really focus on the specialists. They're neat, they're interesting, a lot of them look really neat. But I worry sometimes that is going to get us to neglect some of these generalists that don't really need as much protection, that is for sure. But the ecological role that they do in these ecosystems is extremely important. Well, I think that the next point is illustrated in this very complicated graph. So same general thing on this top part. These are different species of bee. The size of the bar is the number that were available, but they are attached to the top are the different plant species. It doesn't have so much of the organization, but I can highlight the specialists. There are 3 here and 2 there that only went to 1 flower. You can see a lot of these are going to this impatient species. So again, the specialist species do tend to go to these flowers that are preferred by many. But then this species, look at all of the different flowers it is visiting. Right? It is providing a ton of pollination services in that ecosystem. This bottom graph is looking at the 2 generalists, the ones that are blue up here, but I went in and highlighted all of the ones that are representing this species. Now this bottom graph, these are individuals. They are, each of those bars is indicating a bee that was marked and they tracked it. What I find very interesting about this generalist species that is going to a ton of different stuff, some of these are specialists. So within this generalist species, some of the individuals were only going to a single flower species, whereas others were visiting a wide spread of them. So the complexity of what bees are actually going to, well, we're still trying to figure it out. But I mean, I guess that highlights the main thing to focus on if you are trying to enhance bees is just get as many of different ones as you possibly can that are potentially providing a range of these different services. So just in short, how to enhance bee communities, increase your flower diversity is a big one. I would say that that is one of the best ones to do. You want to increase the diversity in the phenology, as much coverage throughout the year as you possibly can. But if you are going for, say, diversity of different species, for bees, you'd be a little bit better off aiming for a diversity of different genera. So aiming for different genus of flower is going to be a little bit more effective for bees than a different species of the same genus. And then increasing the diversity of your nesting resources. Right, it can be those tunnel nesters, but a lot of effort in the soil nesters. And I find this one can be relatively, well, easier than some of these others. But just having a diversity of sand, clay, and silt in different combinations is certainly going to increase your chances of having a wider range of bee species in your area. Hopefully at some point I can generate some specific data on that for this part of the world. We'll take questions, but I do have this. This was mentioned. Pollen reflects UV, right? And so there are absolutely flowers that are going to have a better tendency of attracting bees. But if it is producing pollen, it has a chance of attracting bees. Wind-pollinated flowers that don't do any nectar will still attract bees, and it is because of their ability to see UV. And if you really look at this, they can the way they can tell, I guess probably, when a flower is really ready to have its pollen collected is because of the amount of UV reflectance. So pollen is just loaded with DNA, and DNA is easily damaged by UV. So the plants are just protecting the DNA that's in that pollen by reflecting any UV that hits it, and the bees are capitalizing on it. As soon as it is ready, it is going to shine very bright in the eyes of the bee. And speculation is that they even will kind of notice if a flower has really concentrated UV in the center, or if it's kind of dusted like this, would show evidence of a pollinator has already been there. And they might have more of a tendency to say, skip over it, or a large bee might say, that's not worth my time, whereas a small bee, there's plenty of pollen left behind. So there's still a lot of those sort of things that we're trying to figure out. But certainly can always talk more about bees, but I'll conclude there and answer any questions if you'll have them.
With the habitat, do you need to have any source of water for bees?
So some bees, it seems they probably get the majority of their water through like nectar consumption and just like dew that collects on plants. But like I said, there are some of those mason bees that need to collect water and dirt independently and mix them together. And so it's certainly not hurting anything by kind of having an area where insects and bees can access water. But a lot of these native species, I think, do just fine without it.
A couple of years ago, I think you were talking about working on developing an Arkansas bee atlas. Is that still something you're working towards?
Yes. That is, so hopefully I'll have something out by the end of next year on that. But ultimately when I started on this, we had 243 bee species documented for Arkansas. We're now at around 550. I think I have some new species that we'll be adding. That's speculation. We'll see. But a pretty decent idea of distribution as well. So when I started this project, people were coming to me like, hey, do we have this bee present in Arkansas and where is it? And the answer was, we have no idea. We pretty much only have collections from the 60s. And then I actually think we're at a pretty good place where we can speculate comfortably, even if we don't have that data. Getting pretty good coverage information at this point.
Will it be available electronically or in a print form? Or?
Well, I know it'll be a part of my thesis.
Okay.
But I do hope to, it'll be out and I'll absolutely give it to you and you can spread it around. But I do hope to make like small pamphlets of like common bees as well as potentially even doing more of like a native bees of Arkansas. Maybe even branch out into some of the wasps that are pollinators as well. But I do want to do that. As far as the book goes, that is an idea. So that one's a ways away.
You got a lot on your plate already, so it's time.
Should have pretty good distribution maps and stuff by the end of next year, and at least for a lot of the more common ones.
You were part of that bioinventory project in Washington County, right? I think some
Yes.
of your data was used in that natural heritage.
Yeah, and for that, I just went through the U of A Arthropod Museum and just contacted a few people I knew that had bees from the area. We're going to need to revise that one just a little bit. I just went off of the identifications that were in the collection. Some of those are going to need to be changed, but it's still a pretty good list, especially for this area. And there's pretty good documentation for Washington County. Yes.
As the climate changes in the area, will the bees that we have change also?
It is a fantastic question. I definitely don't have a definitive answer for you. It does seem, that other carpenter bee that's like in the southern half, it does seem to be moving more north.
I know when I was in Master Gardeners, they talked about, we've only been here since 2018, and they talked about that the area used to be 6 or 5, and as far as planting things go, and now we've moved up to like a 7, I think.
Yeah.
And I just wonder what that does. I assume it makes a difference to the plants as well as everything else.
Yeah, we just don't know exactly what that impact is and how widespread it's going to be.
Yeah, they're saying we're moving more tropical than we used to be in this area.
Yeah, I can definitely. Certainly the amount of solar radiation we get they bumped that up, but with temperature it's just temperature and the length of growing season. But we just don't know exactly how that's going to impact bees. We've had some studies with these specialists, and yeah, the flower might be blooming a month early, but the bee's out a month early. And then we'll look at this other interaction and they're completely off. The flower bloomed and the bee comes out a month later. We don't know which species are going to respond which way.
Like with the butterflies, I mean, when I first got here, my milkweed would get things that seemed like the right time, and then there was a time when I would have monarchs laying stuff on the milkweed when it was that tall, and you couldn't really, it was really basically worthless.
Yeah.
Because there was nothing there for them to eat. So that's one of the things that I have been watching over the short time period that we've been here.
We've also had some really weird rain patterns. And whatever you're seeing with the bees is pretty much what happened the year before. And so we had a pretty good year for bees overall, and that was because the year before it was pretty good for flowers, at least at certain points of the year. But the year before that, we had very strange droughts and not very much flower production during some of these key times. And so last year, it really looked bad for the bees because they were responding to the year before. And so there is like a year delay in what you're seeing, and that complicates what's happening just that much more. Because next year, I imagine there's going to be a ton of bees looking for flowers, whether they're available or not, because they've had a very productive year. So,
how does rain affect ground asters? I mean, does that flood them out? I mean, what happens there?
So there's one of the ones this is in Africa. They put their legs in this specialized structure. They use that in their nest. They're tied to that flower. But I know I've got something to illustrate. Oh boy, stick that at the end. I might not have even included that. So, like resin bees are capable of creating that waterproof barrier. There are, we call them plasterer bees or cellophane bees. They make a chemical very, very similar to the plastic cellophane, and that's what I'm looking for. They line their nests with that. And so some species do phenomenal in wetlands and wet areas. But the majority like dry.
So even like if we had heavy rains and soaks in real deep and all that, they have ways to protect their nest.
Yeah, the natives are going to be fine with that because I mean they're adapted to that general weather pattern. They have things in place to help them cope with that sort of stuff. It's a lot of the non-natives, and like the blue orchard bee is not native to this area. It's from the Pacific Northwest. It won't adapt to our conditions all that well, like some of our natives that are in that same genus essentially doing the same thing.
I was really interested about the work on the specialist bees and plants, and you made the comment about how like one bee seemed to specialize on something one year, and the very next year it would choose something totally different.
Yes.
So do you think that like this whole concept of specialist bees is overemphasized, that maybe like we shouldn't focus so much on that, or maybe we're even mistaken with some of these that to think that they're so narrowly focused that really they aren't, it was just at the time of the study?
Yeah, I think that's a great summary of really how I feel about it. Yeah, there's a lot there, and I don't think we do really know. I'm sure some of them are real specialists and are what we're emphasizing, but there's so many bees out there, and they seem very adaptable, that I feel the focus, it shouldn't even be bees, it should be pollinators. The pollinator communities as a whole, if we are just trying to get the swath of species, we're going to do a lot better, definitely, than focusing on a specific bee that might be a specialist. There are some really interesting specialists out there. One is on that purple prairie clover, but the clover is tied to a soil type, and the bee might just be tied to the soil type rather than the flower. And that it's just a wonderful flower. Since we're nesting in that area, yeah, that's the one we're going to. And I actually even caught it on Stenaria, like a bluet, like it's a little small four-petaled flower I've caught several of that specialist I was just talking about. It's Eucera albata, collecting nectar. It wasn't getting pollen, but it was visiting those other flowers. And so I certainly think it's overemphasized, though. But, you know, it's a more simple system when they're consistently going to a flower, and we are at a point where we don't really know all that much. And so there's also kind of this trade-off of focusing on those sort of bees can allow us to focus on some of those other aspects that we don't know. And so it's kind of hard to say with all of the variation. But in general, I mean, bees are fairly hardy. If we're providing a huge diversity of native flowers, that's helping them. And I mean, a lot of those species that specialists like, generalists love too. And so, yeah, let's promote those. There's just a lot there, but it probably is overemphasized, yeah.
I want to tell that the pollinator plants in general, do you usually find that the plants that are pollinated really well by a lot of different things are the ones that you're going to reseed themselves in your garden quicker than, say, the ones that are more inclined to have some sort of specialist? I have bone set, and my bone set doesn't stay very long. I had one that was huge for like a couple of years. Now it's practically gone, but I have tons of bone set. And I know that it's a great pollinator for not just bees, but for all kinds of things. Wasp and all kinds of insects.
Sorry, what was the specific question on that?
I'm wondering if it's if it has more things that come to it, is it more likely to end up having more of it in your garden without you even trying to plant it?
I mean, the seed set should be higher,
yeah.
And in that way, it can. But I mean, mint was mentioned. That one just seems to take over. Pollinators do love mint,
yeah.
But I would just think that there might be some other reason. Bamboo. Bamboo would spread like crazy and without it making a single flower even, right? And so I'm sure that there is something like that that's, you know, some of these native species that are propagating.
Yeah, well, I know like in some of the rhizome spreading ones, I mean, I know it's the roots that cause it to be spreading everywhere.
Well, some can, you know, like self-pollinate and reproduce without that. And so that's why I'm like, I would say like not necessarily, but I'm sure that there's a tendency there, if that makes sense.
And maybe the seeds are even hardier over whatever the winters are.
Yeah, it really could be something like that. Flies are really important pollinators. And sometimes I'll see flowers only flies go to, rattlesnake master. Bees do not seem to like rattlesnake master. I see some on it, but in general, I do not see bees on it. Now, communities with rattlesnake master are great, but it definitely seems wasps and flies are the main pollinator for it. And they're pretty good pollinators. And so, God, it just gets really complicated once you're applying that to these entire systems.
Well, I'm just amazed in just a few years we've been doing it, the different things that I've noticed that, you know, you don't necessarily expect. So.
Yeah, and things change. I have a map from a nature reserve at UCA campus, and it has this area marked off. It is the Black Cherry Reserve because it was really rare at that time, and that was the one patch where you could find it. And now that plant's just everywhere. And so it's really hard. I was talking with someone about beautyberry recently. When I was a kid, it was like rare. I see it all over the place now. It has had some great last 10 years, and it has really kind of propagated, at least in central Arkansas.
That's like the American beautyberry?
Yes,
with
yes.
the purple berries on
Yeah,
it?
some
the
of them.
birds might have had something to do with it because they do like the berries.
Oh yeah, definitely. And it might even be, say, an invasive bird that moved through and just helped that one species. These things get really complicated and a little overwhelming at times. But But yeah, as far as like ones that are like doing well, they're still going to be providing nectar and pollen. And so if they're producing flowers year after year, it's going to be good for the pollinators, no doubt on that. So,
Thank you.
yeah, absolutely. Thank y'all. And feel free to email me if you have any questions. If I can identify something in a picture, I'll do that as well.